Exquisite didn't answer, and the two of them continued on toward the heavenly land. Flocks of phoenixes flew overhead, and holy springs were suspended in the air, surrounded by clouds. Giant dragons walked majestically across the ground, which was covered with many strange flowers and rich green grass. There were many rare animals, too. There were strange and exotic things everywhere that Han Sen looked. Within seconds of landing, Han Sen had seen 3 deified xenogeneics. One of them was a deified plant. This is so scary. I understand now why the very high are regarded as the greatest race in the universe. There are so many resources here. The mighty Extreme King have far less than this? No, they can't even be compared. Put side by side with the very high, the Extreme King would look like a group of hobos. Han Sen was in too much shock to speak. Countless powerful xenogeneics were roaming about, and in the nearby forest, deified xenogeneics were everywhere. Still aboard Exquisite's ship, they flew onward for tens of thousands of miles. There were countless deified xenogeneics nearby, but they had yet to encounter any of the very high. Ever since our race found this place in ancient times, our elders have been bringing interesting xenogeneics here. After God knows how many billions of years, this is what has become of the place. But my people reproduce very slowly. There are only 200 of us left now, and we cannot use the vast majority of the resources that we have gathered over the ages. However, the creatures we have collected breed and breed. They are the fruits of our labor, Exquisite said. So, Han Sen understood why the very high could make so many deified elites now. This place was like an organic treasury. With the resources available, creating deified elites would be easy. Bauer was lying comfortably on the floor of the ship, looking around at the weird flowers and strange grasses. They didn't look special, but Han Sen knew Bauer. He could tell she was prepared to take action. The small boat continued to fly forward. After a while, Han Sen started to think that there was a problem with the flow of time in this place. He couldn't accurately determine how much time had passed since he first saw land. Their ship was drawing close to some cloud-covered mountains, and when they came within range, Han Sen finally saw that the mountains held a collection of palaces. They had been built into and around the mountains, fitting perfectly between them. Faintly obscured by the haze of the clouds, it was like a picture of heaven. When the ship landed at the foot of the mountains, Han Sen noticed a stone staircase. It led all the way up to the stone palace at the mountain's peak. There was a very high man descending the steps. Exquisite, you have returned? Perhaps there was such a thing as a place where the grass was greener, for being born in such a heavenly environment seemed to breed people gracious enough to befit it. Second brother. Exquisite stepped off the ship and bowed before the man. The man waved his hand, signaling for her to refrain from such politeness. He looked at Han Sen and saw Bauer sitting on his shoulder. He frowned. Third sister, why have you brought 2 people? Which one is your silkworm? He is Han's senator. I selected him. That is his daughter. He had to bring her with him because there was no one else willing to look after her in his absence, Exquisite explained. The man nodded and stopped looking at Han Sen and Bauer. He told Exquisite, go. The altar is ready. We may complete the contracts now. Exquisite nodded and told Han Sen, you guys follow me. Don't stray too far.
Han Sen nodded.
He stepped off the ship. As soon as he left the boarding ramp, his body felt as if it was being crushed by a mountain. He moved a bit slower than usual. The environment of outer sky is different from that of the outside universe. You'll just have to get used to it, Exquisite told Han Sen.
Han Sen nodded.
He remained silent and followed Exquisite up the grand staircase. He glanced around. Sister, you could have chosen lone bamboo of the sky. Why did you pick a crystallizer? Crystallizer bodies are unremarkable. They cannot amount to much, the man said to Exquisite as they ascended the steps. He certainly didn't beat around the bush. Why does this guy not look like one of the very high? Han Sen wondered as he inspected the man. The man's insult hadn't bothered him. The fellow looked different from Likir, Bishi, and Exquisite. He looked fairly average, in truth. He didn't appear to be as cold as the other very high that Han Sen had encountered so far. Exquisite said something non-committal, clearly not interested in the conversation. The 4 of them reached the halfway point on their journey up the mountain. There, They found a stone pavilion residing on a stone platform. The stone pavilion's name was written as Half-Life Fate. Han Sen didn't know what it meant, but another man soon approached. He waved his hand at Han Sen and said, "You've come here to be exquisite silkworm? According to the rules of the Very High, only someone with a 9 armor talent is eligible to sign the contract. Allow me to test you." The man didn't seem to know Han Sen had already been tested. He walked him to the pavilion and opened a stone canister that was cradled by a stone table. When the lid was removed, Han Sen could see another God Spirit touch lying inside the canister. "Give the God Spirit touch a drop of your blood and wait for the results." The man pointed at the God Spirit touch for Han Sen. "Second brother, there is no need to test him. Brother Bishi has already tested him with a God Spirit touch. He has an armor talent figure of 11. He is more than suitable to be a silkworm," Exquisite said. "An 11 armor talent? He's just a crystallizer. He cannot have an 11 armor talent. You're joking with us, surely. Or did Bishi make a mistake?" The meager talents of crystallizers aside, even we of the Very High very rarely produce offspring with an armor talent of 11, so he still needs to undergo this test. I don't want a mistaken test result to delay this process. The man's mouth was like a machine gun as he kept talking. Han Sen didn't bother paying attention to the man's rambling. He approached the stone canister and lifted the middle finger of his right hand. He squeezed out a drop of blood and gave it to the God Spirit's touch. Exquisite's eyes locked on the God Spirit touch. Despite what she had said earlier, she did want to find out if the test conducted before was legitimate. Saying Han Sen had an 11 armor talent still seemed ludicrous, so a second test was warranted. The man stared at the God Spirit touch, too. He didn't believe a crystallizer could have an 11 armor talent. He thought something must have happened when Bishi tested Han Sen, and that was why the result was incorrect. They all stared at the God Spirit touch intensely. But after the God Spirit touch consumed the blood, it stopped moving. They kept watching for some time, but the creature remained completely still. It didn't even shed a single shell. Exquisite was surprised, and the men thought this was strange. No matter how bad a crystallizer was, there was no way the bug wouldn't discard a single shell. Weird. Is there a problem with the God Spirit touch? The man reached out a finger and brushed it against the God Spirit touch's head. His face twisted with confusion as he said, "There's nothing wrong with the creature. It is just the same as before. How could this happen?" "Feed him another drop of blood," the man told Han Sen after he examined the God Spirit touch. Han Sen didn't know what to make of this turn of events. He did just as he was instructed and squeezed out another droplet of blood to feed the God Spirit touch. When Han Sen placed the second drop of blood before the God Spirit touch, it didn't behave any differently. It swallowed the droplet, then returned to its previous, motionless state. The four waited around for a long time, hoping something would happen. But there the bug remained, at the bottom of the canister, not moving an inch. If they hadn't seen it swallow the blood, they would have believed the insect to be dead. The man frowned. He had no idea what was going on. He picked up the God Spirit touch again, trying to make sure there was nothing wrong with it. Weird. No matter how bad his skills are, it shouldn't be possible for him to be entirely without an armor talent. The man continued to poke and investigate the creature, but he learned nothing. Maybe the God Spirit touch is simply too old, and it can no longer shed its shell? Exquisite paused, then went on to say, "This God Spirit touch is the very first God Spirit touch that once belonged to the Alpha, is it not? It performed tests here for much of the Alpha's life, and that was eons ago. Perhaps it really has finally succumbed to old age." The man shook his head and said, "When Bishi brought you Shanshin here, they conducted the test just fine. That wasn't very long ago. Why would it suddenly stop working now?" "Well, aside from that, what other possibilities can you think of? There is no way that Han Sen is lacking even a single armor talent," Exquisite said. The man knew that was impossible, too. Without a 4 armor talent or above, reaching King class was impossible. If Han Sen was already King class, no matter how bad his talents were, he couldn't have an armor talent less than 4. "This is weird," the man said with queer hesitation. He put out his finger and sliced it, releasing a thin trickle of his own blood. He let it bleed near the god spirit touch's mouth to see if the creature reacted like normal. The god spirit touch had been lying in the same spot ever since consuming Han Sen's blood. It didn't react to the man's blood at all. It was like it had become too old and numb to move a muscle. It really is growing feeble in its old age? The man put his face close to the creature, staring at it in shock. It has lived long enough. It has lived longer than most ordinary god spirit touches. Its aging was to be expected, eventually, Exquisite said. We cannot conduct the test now, the man said quietly. I don't have another god spirit touch nearby. It looks like we will have to go back and request another one. Then, we can take the test. Stop testing him. I've decided to make him my silkworm, so it doesn't matter what armor talent he has, Exquisite said icily.
But
the man started to say something, but Exquisite swiftly cut him off. I don't have time for this. I can decide who I want to be my silkworm, and look, I have made my decision. The man opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Eventually, he smiled and said, If you have made your decision to accept this boy as your silkworm, then that is fine. In that case, let us proceed to the altar. After that, the man led them the remainder of the way. They continued on up the mountain. When they reached the palace that rested on the mountain top, the man turned and said, Exquisite, I will be waiting for you outside. If you need anything, please just ask. Second brother, please take care of this child. I like this child, so do not upset her, Exquisite said while looking at Bower. Don't worry, Exquisite. I will take care of her, the man quickly assured her. Bower, wait for me here, and don't be a naughty girl. Okay.
Han Sen put Bower down.
With Bower's personality and power, it wouldn't go well for the man if he tried anything. I'll be very nice, Dad, Bower said, looking sweetly up at Han Sen. Han Sen stroked her head and went to the hall with Exquisite. After they entered the hall door closed behind them. Han Sen couldn't see hide nor hair of anyone else in the hall. There was an altar at its end, however, and the sight of it prompted him to ask, That second brother seems different from the other people here. Exquisite continued walking toward the altar, but on her way, she said, The children of the very high are separated into two groups. One group suffers the very high sense, whereas the others can practice the Geno arts they truly fancy. Brother Bishi and I studied the very high sense. Second brother Liu studied something else. Why do you have to be separated? Han Sen asked with curiosity. Exquisite twitched slightly, but she pretended it was nothing. Practicing the very high sense gradually removes our ability to feel emotions. That can harm our breeding capabilities. Now Han Sen understood why they had to be separated. It was so their bloodline could continue. Otherwise, if all of the very high transformed themselves into emotionless machines, they probably wouldn't reproduce at all. The race wouldn't have lasted very long in that case. Han Sen raised his head. The altar ahead looked a bit strange. There was a large platform that held a large furnace in its center. Aside from that, the altar was bare. Put a drop of your blood into the furnace, Exquisite said. She held out her finger and dropped her blood into it. Han Sen had known this was coming. Sky Palace leader had told him what to expect. He lifted his own finger and quickly supplied the furnace with a drop of his blood. When the jade furnace took in the 2 drops of blood, it lit up. It began to glow with a shifting cosmic light, and something inside the furnace began to rumble. Han Sen looked at the jade furnace with curiosity. He couldn't see what was inside it, but the light and presence of the furnace were enough for him to tell that it was stuffed with knowledge about the universe. As the light grew stronger, it began to gather on the carving on the front of the furnace. The engraved symbols were shaped into a rough triangle. The light continued to shift restlessly, and the engraving glowed brighter and brighter. And then, the light within the furnace dimmed as it all rushed into the engraving. When the triangular symbol burned like a sun, Exquisite said, "Put your hand against that symbol." "Which hand?" Han Sen asked with a blink. "It is up to you," Exquisite said. "Men go left, women go right. In that case, I will use my left hand." After that, Han Sen placed his left hand on the triangular symbol. Han Sen felt as if he had pressed his hand against red-hot steel. Han Sen jerked his hand away, and when he did, The light on the jade furnace's engraving vanished. A shining triangle was now branded on his left hand. When the burning sensation disappeared, the triangle vanished as well. Han Sen could no longer find any trace of it on his skin. Is that it? Han Sen looked at Exquisite with curiosity. Yes, it is done, Exquisite answered with a nod. Han Sen knew that at this point, Exquisite should be able to feel what he felt and read his mind. His mind should have been an open book to her. So, he started imagining stuff to test it. In a split second, Exquisite blushed and shouted, "Stop! It looks like you really can read my mind," Han Sen said while looking at Exquisite. "It's good that you know. Don't ever think of things like that again," Exquisite said, feigning calmness over what she had just seen. The silkworms of other races might not have known they were being watched by the Very High, but it wasn't surprising that the Sky knew about this, though. After all, the Sky and the Very High were once part of the same family, and the Very High had never tried to hide the fact that they spied on their silkworms. So, Exquisite didn't think it was strange that Han Sen knew about this. "Let's go. I will help you practice here in Outer Sky. How many resources you receive over the course of the next 4 years will depend on how well you perform." Exquisite turned and walked out of the palace. "Is that it?" Han Sen asked her with some curiosity. "Well, what else did you expect?" Exquisite asked. "Don't we need to meet with some supervisors and go through additional registration procedures or something?" Han Sen was confused. Since they had arrived, the only other Very High he had seen was Second Brother. And Second Brother probably wasn't an important figure amongst the Very High. His rank was certainly not as high as Exquisite's, that was for sure. There is no need for any of that. Now that you've entered Outer Sky, your movements will be watched keenly by the leader. Since no one has come here to stop you, that means our leaders have given you their approval. You can now be my silkworm and practice here in Outer Sky. The way the Very High do things is quite different. Considering that they were the #1 race in the universe, the Very High were conducting themselves very casually. But when Han Sen thought about their relaxed attitude a little more, he realized that he should have expected it. The Very High were incredibly powerful, but there weren't many of them, and they had no interest in mixing their blood with the blood of another race. Plus, after they practiced the Very High sense, they lost their ability to care about things. Based on what he knew of the Very High, this process was proceeding logically. After Han Sen left the hall, he found Bauer and Second Brother, Li Yuzhen, chatting. It seemed that they were getting along rather well. That was a surprise. Li Yuzhen wanted to accompany Exquisite, but she refused. He didn't push the subject further, and so he promptly took his leave. They reboarded Exquisite's small ship and began flying east, away from the heavenly-looking palace. "Bauer, what were you talking to Li Yuzhen about?" Han Sen didn't believe Bauer would have been nice enough to engage Li Yuzhen in idle conversation unless there was something she wanted. "It was nothing much. He is nice. He promised me a lot of fun toys," Bauer said with a blink. "Why would he suddenly give you things?" Han Sen asked. "He said that if I tell him more about Sister Exquisite, he will bring me more stuff to play with," Bauer naively explained. Han Sen thought about this, and he had a guess. If Li Yuzhen is one of the people responsible for ensuring the existence of future generations of Very High, then he probably wants to. When Han Sen thought of that, Exquisite's face hardened. She stared at him and said, "Don't even think about it. He has zero chance." Han Sen shrugged his shoulders. He knew his assumption had been correct. The ship traveled for 100,000 miles before they stopped atop a little peak. That mountaintop had a wooden building and pavilion. It looked rather tidy. He thought it must have been where Exquisite lived. Exquisite set Han Sen up inside the wooden building, then left. Once Exquisite was completely gone from sight, Han Sen pulled something out of his pocket. Sky Palace Leader had given it to him. It was a small jade figure that was around the size of his hand. Sky Palace Leader said that once she is some distance away from me, Exquisite's ability to monitor me will weaken, or perhaps even disappear entirely. The distance must be considerable, though. That is what Sky Palace Leader told me. She probably can't read my 7 senses now, right? Han Sen tried not to think. Keeping his mind as empty as possible, he lifted the small jade figure in his left hand. The small jade figure came to life with light. The light wasn't actually coming from the small statue. though. It was coming from Han Sen's hand. The triangular brand on his hand was glowing, and it slowly began to twist into the shape of the jade figure. I can't believe Sky Palace leader came through with this. It really does work. Han Sen looked at the outline of the statue that was now shining from his hand. The sight of it made him ecstatic. Han Sen had no idea what the small jade figure actually was. Sky Palace leader had told Han Sen how to use it, but he hadn't bothered to explain exactly how the device worked. In truth, the small jade figure was a magical device that worked a little like a video camera. However, instead of merely recording visual information, the device captured data from each of Han Sen's 7 senses. Once he pressed the statue against the triangular brand on his hand, Exquisite was no longer able to sense what Han Sen was currently feeling. Instead, she was now experiencing a recorded loop of sensation. The information that Exquisite could learn now were all things that Han Sen was fine with her knowing. Han Sen had recorded a lot of content into the statue, most of which were the sensations that he experienced while he practiced. If Exquisite wasn't actually watching him in person, she would assume that he was training. Let's see how this works. As Han Sen held the small jade figure, he recorded more of his own thoughts and senses. It was very difficult for a human to control their emotions perfectly, but Han Sen had some experience in doing so. He thought for a moment, then started making a new recording. He thought to himself, Lady Exquisite is so beautiful and cute, and she is so kind. She is the best woman I have ever known. Although I can't be friends with her, as long as I am able to keep protecting her, it is enough. After the recording, Han Sen double-checked how it would come across. He made sure all of the recordings were positive and presented him in a good light. Then, he put away the small jade figure. If Exquisite was spying on his 7 senses, all she would see was the content that Han Sen had recorded. Han Sen could choose what he wanted Exquisite to see. Of course, if they were face-to-face, Han Sen could set the small jade figure to run in sync. That way, he could keep Exquisite from growing suspicious. Right now, Sky Palace leader's plan seemed to be working, but Han Sen couldn't be entirely certain. If Exquisite managed to figure out what he was doing, he would have to find another method of shielding his mind. As Han Sen waited for Exquisite to return so that he could see if his attempts to protect his mind were succeeding, something suddenly flew in through his window. Han Sen was shocked. At first, he thought it was some kind of xenogenic. Otherwise, why would it have come in through the window instead of the door? Han Sen leaned closer to the beetle-like bug that had flown in through the window. It was the god spirit touch that Han Sen had seen in Half-Life Fate. He instantly sighed in relief. He knew the god spirit touch couldn't attack, so he wasn't too afraid. Why did it come here? Han Sen wondered. The god spirit touch flew in front of Han Sen, and Han Sen reached out and closed his hand around the bug. It didn't try to evade Han Sen's hand. It seemed to accept him. See. The god spirit touch settled itself in Han Sen's palm, then flapped its wings and made some strange noises. It seemed like the little creature wanted to tell him something. As Han Sen was wondering what the god spirit touch wanted, he suddenly received a thought. Give me a few more drops of your blood. Han Sen was shocked. He had encountered a god spirit touch before, so he knew that they were capable of basic communication. This god spirit touch was far stronger than the last one he had seen, though. In Sky Palace, the thoughts of Bishi's god spirit touch had been blurry and undefined. Han Sen had experienced the creature's thoughts more as feelings than as direct communication. But the mind of this god spirit touch was very clear, as if it was speaking directly into his ears. Why would I give you a few drops of my blood? Han Sen looked at the god spirit touch he was cradling in his hands with great interest. Swap, the god spirit touch's voice said into Han Sen's mind once more. This god spirit touch really can communicate. If they live long enough, they can evolve, it seems. This guy was around when the Very High Alpha was alive. It must have traveled the entire universe with the Very High Alpha. It really is special. Han Sen was shocked. What do you want to exchange? Han Sen asked. Follow me, the god spirit touch said. It then flapped its wings and soared out of the wooden building. Carrying Bauer, Han Sen spared no time in following the little bug. He was keen to see what the god spirit touch was offering in trade. Exquisite had warned him not to leave the mountain. If he left it, he could be in danger. But that didn't stop him from following the God Spirit touch. Besides, as long as he didn't go too far, there was no reason for him to be afraid. The God Spirit touch flew extremely fast. It was faster than Senator Han Sen summoned all his power as he struggled to keep up with it. They flew for most of the day. The God Spirit touch didn't fly in a straight line, either. It zigzagged and flew every which way. Its erratic flight patterns seemed to indicate that it was very afraid of something. Many deified xenogeneics roamed freely across outer sky, and Han Sen was worried he might run into some of them. If he encountered a deified that was transmutation class or above, he would be unable to fight it. His worries were put at ease after a while, though. On his way, he didn't notice any such xenogeneics. The only xenogeneics he spotted were weaker ones that wouldn't pose as much of a threat. In the end, the God Spirit touch came to a stop in a valley. Han Sen could see that the valley was lush and verdant. There was a lot of vegetation there, including a large bamboo forest. The bamboo was a rich green that seemed to shine like jade. The God Spirit touch flew into the bamboo forest, and Han Sen pursued. They came to an empty field in the middle of the bamboo forest, and in that field, there was a patch of small white flowers. When Han Sen drew closer, he noticed that the little white flowers were far from ordinary. They looked like flower fairies that were clad in white robes. Their tiny faces were lovely, and when Han Sen looked closer, he could even see their little eyelashes. But those flower fairies all had their eyes closed. It was difficult to discern if they were truly living beings. The God Spirit touch flew through the clearing, flapping its wings hard enough to create a little breeze. When the breeze rustled the flowers, it roused the flower fairies to wakefulness. But when they opened their eyes, their bodies shook in the wind. They all squeezed together as if they were very afraid of something. "I offer these in trade," the God Spirit touch said as it landed near the flowers. Again, it had used its mind to communicate with Han Sen. "What are these things?" Han Sen looked at the white flowers that looked like fairies. He detected a powerful life force within each of them. "Flower fairies," the God Spirit touch answered. "What do they do?" Han Sen asked. "God King bees love them," the God Spirit touch said through its mind again. "What does that mean?" Han Sen didn't understand. "You use them to attract God King bees. You are going to need them." While this God Spirit touch's thoughts were much clearer than Han Sen had expected, there were still limits to its communication abilities. It could say something simple, but explaining a complex subject was beyond the little creature. Han Sen listened as the God Spirit touch tried to explain. These fairy flowers could attract God King bees, and God King bees could somehow benefit Han Sen. Of course, that was just what the God Spirit touch believed. And Han Sen had never even heard of a God King bee. Therefore, he couldn't be entirely sure that what the bug was suggesting would work. "In exchange, how much blood are you asking for?" Han Sen asked, looking at the God Spirit touch. 100 drops, the God Spirit touch said in Han Sen's mind. "That is too much. How about 1 flower per drop?" "Hold on, let me count. There are 17 flower fairies, so I will give you 17 drops of blood. How is that for a bargain?" Han Sen asked, flexing his haggling chops. Han Sen wasn't in a rush to get the flower fairies. After all, he wasn't sure what sort of benefit they would ultimately provide. He was, however, very interested in the God Spirit touch. It knew outer sky very well, so there was a chance the creature would be quite useful sometime in the future. Forming a good relationship with it might come in handy later on. "Sure," the God Spirit touch answered with certainty. "How do I use these things?" Han Sen asked, looking at the fairy flowers. "Dig out the roots and take them with you," the God Spirit touch answered. "Will they die?" Han Sen looked at the white flowers that looked like fairies. He didn't want to hurt the beautiful creatures any more than he had to. "No, but plant them in your yard when you get back," the God Spirit touch said. "Sure." Han Sen rolled up his sleeves and got to gardening. He started digging up the flowers one by one. "Blood," the God Spirit touch requested, flying over and landing atop Han Sen's hand. Han Sen didn't hesitate. He squeezed out 17 drops of blood and let them pool in the palm of his hand. The God Spirit touch fell on the blood like a hungry wolf. It gulped it all down, draining the 17 drops of blood instantly. The creature's crystalline body was dyed light red. It looked like an artwork made of pink crystal. Han Sen dug all the fairy flowers from the ground. While there were 17 different flowers, their roots had grown together into a single mass. The root ball was about 30 centimeters wide. The fairy flowers trembled as he worked, looking scared. "Don't worry. I don't want to hurt you guys," Han Sen soothed them with a smile. Those creatures were very adorable. Even if they were edible, Han Sen wouldn't want to eat them. The god spirit touch suddenly flew up and away from Han Sen's hand. It landed on the ground and started digging, drilling into the soil next to the root ball. "What are you doing in there?" Han Sen asked with curiosity. "I am sleeping," the god spirit touch's voice said in his mind. The creature had already disappeared under the soil, so Han Sen couldn't see it anymore. Han Sen asked a few more questions, but he received no response from the god spirit touch. At that point, he knew that he needed to return to the wooden house with the fairy flowers. Exquisite must know how to make use of these fairy flowers. "I'll have to ask her later." Han Sen flew up out of the clearing, then turned and headed back to the mountain where the wooden house was. Before Han Sen made it all the way back to the house, however, the small jade figure vibrated and lit up. That meant Exquisite was back in range. She could sense Han Sen again. When Exquisite returned to the wooden house, she frowned. It seemed that Han Sen had already left. The further away from her that Han Sen was, the weaker her connection with him became. Now, she could only sense what direction Han Sen had gone off in and get a faint feel for his current state of emotion. All Exquisite could tell was that Han Sen was feeling happy. She couldn't really feel anything other than that. But if he felt happy, that meant he hadn't encountered any trouble. And that suggested she didn't have to worry about him too much. He is quite daring. He's just arrived in outer sky, and yet he has already run off so far on his own. Doesn't he realize how many deified xenogeneics there are roaming around? Even if he uses his deified treasures to bolster his power, it will still be hard for him to survive out there amidst those ancient monsters, Exquisite thought to herself. Han Sen was getting close to the wooden house now, and as he approached, Exquisite was able to sense more and more about him. After an hour, she could sense that he was holding a bunch of flowers. But Exquisite could only feel and not see, which was a shame. She could sense how careful Han Sen was being to hold the flowers without crushing them, but she couldn't see what he was seeing. So, she could only guess what he was holding by judging his sense of touch. Han Sen's happiness ran through her. It seemed that he might have already discovered a treasure of some kind. Fairy flowers, Exquisite realized, when Han Sen was finally close enough for her to detect what he was thinking about. Han Sen had collected fairy flowers. He didn't know how to use them, though. So, he was bringing the flowers back to ask her what they were for. How is that possible? Exquisite couldn't believe Han Sen had somehow managed to find fairy flowers. Those flowers were quite unusual. Many of the very high wanted fairy flowers, but the strange plants were incredibly rare. Han Sen had only been in outer sky for 2 days, and already he had come across fairy flowers. This really was so weird. Since Exquisite still couldn't see Han Sen with her own eyes, she didn't believe Han Sen had discovered real fairy flowers, though. He must have been mistaken about what he had. But when Han Sen appeared in her vision, Exquisite's eyes opened wide. Han Sen was holding real fairy flowers, and not just one, but several. There were 17 individual flowers on the plant. Fairy flowers only opened a single bloom every 100 million years. There were 17 flowers here, so that meant the plant had been alive for 1.7 billion years. Across the whole history of the very high, 1.7 billion years wasn't very long, but it was very rare to find a fairy flower that had been growing for that length of time. Even if someone was lucky enough to find a fairy flower, it usually only had 2 or 3 blossoms. In the very high palace, there was a very old fairy flower that had 72 blossoms on it. That number of blossoms seemed to be the maximum that a fairy flower could achieve. The plant had never grown any further. That flower was called the Fairy King flower, and it was the very high's most important flower. Han Sen's fairy flower had 17 blossoms. That wasn't a bad sum. If he was able to grow it and keep it alive, it could help him a lot. Why did you run out there all alone? Exquisite asked when Han Sen had returned to the yard. I thought I'd go check out the neighborhood. And look, I found a strange bunch of flowers. Do you know what these things do? Han Sen asked, holding out the fairy flowers as if he had just stumbled upon them. He didn't mention the trade he had conducted with the god spirit touch. Although Exquisite knew that Han Sen wasn't saying something important, she still listened to what Han Sen told her. Then, she answered, that is a fairy flower. If you can grow it, it could very well become a true god-class plant xenogenic. But it grows incredibly slowly. It will only produce one flower every 100 million years. Once it has 72 flowers, it will become a butterfly. Whether it can become a true god after that will depend on its luck and power. After pausing, Exquisite looked at the plant in Han Sen's hand and said, the plant you found has 17 flowers. It should be half deified already. If it produces one more blossom, it will become deified. 100 million years per flower? Right now, there isn't even another bud. I'm afraid I won't live long enough for it to grow its 18th flower, Han Sen said with a sardonic smile. 100 million years was far too long for him to wait. No human had a lifespan that long. Maybe not. Fairy flowers don't show signs of their growth. When the time comes, a new blossom will simply sprout overnight. Maybe this plant is very close to having another flower already, Exquisite said. What use are the flowers anyway? Han Sen asked. After a moment of thought, Exquisite told him, the flower has multiple uses. It can be used to produce medicine, but unless the medicine was direly necessary, no one would use it for that purpose. Instead, people prefer to transplant the flowers into their own gardens. The presence of the fairy flower helps nearby plants and creatures to develop. Having a fairy flower in close proximity can also boost one's life force and add to one's lifespan. And, after a while, the fairy flower will attract god king bees. That is what yields the greatest benefit. What benefit is that? Han Sen quickly asked. After a god king bee eats the nectar of a fairy flower, it will become drunk and slump down underneath the fairy flower, Exquisite said. It is about 10,000 times easier to take out god king bees that way. If this plant can become deified and attract deified god king bees, that would be fairly awesome. But I need one more flower before that happens. I don't know when it will grow that 18th flower, Han Sen mumbled, his voice a little dull. He felt as if his luck was far inferior to the luck of others. He only needed one more flower. If he could attract deified god king bees and kill them easily, that would be a great boost to his development. Exquisite could sense that Han Sen was feeling a bit disappointed, and so she said unsympathetically, you can still attract half-deified god king bees, which isn't too bad at all. It is a very good resource for you at your current level. I have a few Geno arts. Take a look and tell me if you want one. If you would like a different Geno art, feel free to tell me. Exquisite placed a few books down on Han Sen's desk. Han Sen picked up a few of the books and perused them. One of them, which Han Sen had already practiced, was God's Wander. But Han Sen hadn't known it was called God's Wander. He thought it was just a good space teleportation technique. Aside from God's Wander, there was an assortment of knife skills, punching techniques, and a Geno art called Very Real Body. Very Real Body was a Geno art that strengthened a practitioner's body. If he practiced it very well, he would be able to use his body to block any physical attack. Even deified elites wouldn't be able to harm him. Exquisite had obviously selected these Geno arts based on her interpretation of Han Sen's character. They were all skills Han Sen would be very good at. It seemed as if Exquisite had gone through a lot of effort to find them. Thank you very much. Han Sen greatly appreciated her kindness. These are only what my silkworm deserves. You just need to keep practicing. If you are lacking anything, make sure to let me know, Exquisite coldly said. After pausing, Exquisite glanced at the text for Very Real Body and said, this copy of Very Real Body is only the basic version. It is suitable for people who haven't yet become deified. If you can become deified, I can get you the rest of this Geno art, and you can become deified with it. Very Real Body can be practiced all the way to butterfly class. It is a Geno art that reinforces your body. I noticed your body was strong, so I thought you might as well try it. Han Sen agreed with her. He accepted the Geno arts she had brought him and planted the fairy flowers in the garden. He was going to wait until the god king bees came, so he could kill them with ease. There are a lot of resources to be earned from outer skies engineers, but they are very dangerous for ordinary students to obtain. This house will keep any deified Zenigenic from approaching within 1,000 miles. It is hard to say what will become of you if you leave that radius, however. If you are out by yourself and encounter danger, I'm afraid I won't be able to save you in time. So, if you want to go hunting for some reason, we should go together, Exquisite said. What kind of primitive deified Zenigenics around here can I hunt? Han Sen asked. Since he was there, anyway, he wanted to acquire more deified resources. They are everywhere. Our people haven't raised them on purpose, but the creatures have multiplied on their own over the years. They don't bother the homes of the very high, but they can travel freely wherever else they wish to go. So, when you leave the designated safe zones, you must be wary wherever you tread. There are larvae and even butterfly Zenigenics to be found. A creature like that could end your life by exhaling in your direction, Exquisite said. Han Sen was stunned. I thought there were resources I could take freely. Why are they that dangerous to obtain? If you want resources, you don't have to go and hunt them yourself. Our race has stockpiles for your enjoyment, Exquisite said. She now spoke in a different tone of voice as she looked at Han Sen. What have they got for me? Han Sen asked. Follow me, Exquisite said simply. She led Han Sen out of the garden. But this time, Exquisite didn't use her little ship. She put her hand on Han Sen's shoulder, and all of a sudden, a space teleportation trick teleported them God knew how far. When they came out on the other side, Exquisite didn't release her grip on him. She used her teleportation ability again. She did this a dozen times before they came to a stop. Han Sen saw beads of sweat on her forehead, and on top of that, her face was flushed red. It had cost her a lot of strength to bring him so far on a whim. We are here, Exquisite said, looking forward. Han Sen followed her gaze. An odd lake lay before them. The lake was full of clouds rather than water. Han Sen thought that the surface of the lake might merely have been obscured by a deep mist, but when he looked down, he realized he couldn't peer through the fog. Despite the strength of Han Sen's vision, he couldn't see anything deeper than 10 meters. But all 10 of those meters were clouds and nothing more. There was no sign of water within that hanging mist, and something that shimmered was moving within the vapor. This lake is called Underworld Lake because outer sky resides between the real world and the antimatter world. It is sometimes said that this lake is a connecting point between the real world and the antimatter world, a way for us to access the antimatter world. I don't know if that is true, Exquisite explained, as she pointed towards the strange lake. No one has gone diving here before? Han Sen asked with curiosity. He had heard the various theories of antimatter worlds, but what he had heard was merely hearsay. He didn't know if any of the rumors were true. People have gone in before, but the people who go down, no matter how strong they are, never return. They are never seen again, Exquisite said, her voice emotionless. Then why are we here? You aren't going to make me go down there, are you? Han Sen looked at Exquisite, slightly alarmed. Exquisite laughed and said, No, of course not. Although the underworld lake can be dangerous, it is perfectly safe as long as you don't go inside. You can, however, do things like go fishing. If you get lucky, you might pull something sweet from there. We can fish in the clouds? What can we fish for? I thought you said this is connected with the antimaterial world. Is the antimaterial world occupied by fish and shrimp, or something? Han Sen asked, raising an eyebrow at Exquisite. Instead of answering, Exquisite pulled out a spool of silk-like wire and pushed it into Han Sen's hands. Over the next few days, you should take a load off and fish here. Once you catch something, it will be easier for you to understand what is going on. Han Sen looked at the spool of silk and noticed that the line was as thin as a hair. It looked gray. It wasn't as shiny as actual silk. In fact, it looked fairly dull. Han Sen continued to examine the thread. This entire situation was strange. She hadn't given him a fishing rod, and there wasn't even a hook on the line. Not even Jiang Taigong would excel with such primitive tools. Although that guy hadn't had a hook for his line, he had a proper rod, at least. Han Sen had been given nothing. All he had was a wire. There is no fish hook, and neither is there any bait. How am I supposed to fish out anything with this? Han Sen asked, looking skeptically at Exquisite. but she must have had her reasons for giving him such a tool. Put some of your blood on it and give it a try, Exquisite instructed. Han Sen put a drop of his blood onto the wire and thought to himself, is this the very high or an enclave of vampires? Everything here requires blood. Exquisite could sense what Han Sen was thinking, and so she blinked and said, actually, it doesn't really require blood. It just needs your genes, in one form or another. Blood is the easiest, so? Han Sen found himself speechless, but he wasn't in the mood to argue with her. The line absorbed Han Sen's blood, and then it jerked and flew up out of his hand. The line nestled itself amidst Han Sen's hair, then disappeared. Han Sen was shocked. He realized that there was now a single strand of silver in his hair. It was the silk he had just received. But now, the piece of silk seemed to be connected to Han Sen's mind. The silk obeyed any mental instructions that Han Sen gave it. It could be as long or as short as he commanded it to. It was as if it was alive. What is this thing? Han Sen asked, turning to Exquisite once more. It is a xenogenic treasure called Underworld Silk, Exquisite explained. It is made of cloud silk essence from Underworld Lake. There are no tiers of this item, and you cannot attack with it. Its fitness isn't high, either. Even an ordinary person could rip it with ease. But it is the only thing that can return from the Underworld Lake. You can use it to fish in Underworld Lake. Then why am I using my blood for fish bait? Han Sen wasn't happy. Exquisite was explaining things a bit at a time, instead of telling him everything up front. Han Sen wasn't a big fan of that. You don't need bait. Your genes are a part of the Underworld Silk now. Your presence is in it now, and that presence is your bait. After pausing, Exquisite went on to say, I still have things to do, and I'm needed elsewhere for a while. Until I come back, I expect you to be fishing here. Don't go too far from this place. There are far too many xenogenics in this area. They won't come to the shores of the Underworld Lake, so remaining here is the safest place for you. I would like to fish too, Bauer said. She stared directly at Exquisite as she spoke. We only have one of these Underworld silks to spare. I will bring you another one next time, Exquisite said to Bauer. Before Han Sen could say anything, she used her space teleportation and vanished. Han Sen's heart jumped. The Underworld silk lengthened, stretching past his hand and down to his feet. It snaked its way down into the Underworld Lake. Can I really fish something out of there? Han Sen looked at the strand of Underworld silk that had now disappeared quietly into the Underworld Lake. Han Sen had serious doubts about this. Han Sen was a little bit curious. He sat down near where the Underworld silk disappeared into the clouds, and he decided to wait and see what happened. But after he waited for a whole hour, the Underworld silk hadn't moved an inch. He couldn't tell if it was working or not. Exquisite isn't trying to test my patience, is she? Han Sen wondered to himself. And then he looked at Bauer and said, Bauer, do you fancy doing some fishing? Yeah, I would like to, Bauer said with a nod. In that case, I will give it to you. Han Sen handed over his Underworld silk. Don't worry, Dad. I'm going to catch some super big fish for you, Bauer said. She had wanted to try fishing a long time ago, and now Han Sen was making good on a long-awaited promise. Sure you will, Han Sen said encouragingly, not wanting to crush her hopes. But inside, he was thinking, there is no hook and no bait. You won't be able to pull anything out of this lake. Do you really think you are Jiang Taigong, who can fish with nothing but a rod and line? Bauer had a stern and serious look on her face while she fished. Han Sen, in the meantime, began to flip through the text for very real body. The knife skills and punching techniques were good. They were top-dog Geno arts for sure, but Han Sen's knife skills and boxing talents were already high-class. He only needed to briefly glance over the skills that Exquisite had brought him. There was no point in practicing them with any modicum of seriousness. Han Sen had already trained in the use of God's Wander. He just needed to slowly reveal his proficiency with it to Exquisite. Han Sen thought the very real body was extremely interesting, however. It was a skill that could reinforce his body, and at the same time, it could make his body into a weapon. Very real body had a high requirement for the practitioner's base level strength, though. Even ordinary deifieds might not have the requisite physical power for the beginner level of very real body. Han Sen, on the other hand, had a body that was stronger than any half-deified. The power granted by his 4 Geno arts wasn't something ordinary creatures could match. So, fulfilling the requirements for very real body wasn't too difficult for him. In fact, this was the reason that Exquisite had given him very real body. An extreme body works as a blade. Once I learn this Geno art, I should be able to fight others of the same level, even if they're making use of a xenogenic weapon. That is pretty cool. After Han Sen read through it once, he began to practice very real body. But it would take a very long time for Han Sen to practice and become talented with this Geno art. This wasn't a task that he could accomplish in a day, and so Han Sen wasn't in a crazy rush. He trained slowly, and he also practiced heart connection in the meantime. Han Sen set the small jade figure into a fishing mode. Even if Exquisite turned her attention back to him, she would only sense him fishing. She wouldn't realize that it was Bauer doing the fishing for him. Bauer was still as serious about fishing as when she had begun. Han Sen was surprised. He didn't expect that the normally rambunctious Bauer would be content to spend time with the slow, patience-testing, quiet art of fishing. What a shame. This fishing line seems entirely useless. Han Sen thought Exquisite really was testing his patience. There was no way they would be reeling anything in. Dad, there is something on my line. Bauer suddenly shouted with glee. She held onto the underworld silk for dear life with those little hands of hers. No way. You've actually caught something? Han Sen quickly looked at the underworld lake. He saw that the lake's mist was swirling around the underworld silk. The mist had grown more cloudy, as if there really was something down there moving about. Pull the line. Pull the line. Han Sen ran behind Bauer and started reeling the underworld silk back with her. Whatever was on the other end was quite heavy, and Han Sen was worried that the underworld silk might break. Fortunately, his worries didn't come to pass. The underworld silk remained undamaged as the two of them hauled it out. As more and more of the lake's mist was disturbed by the rising object, their excitement grew as well. Hurry up! Hurry up! We might have caught something big, Han Sen was happily shouting. I want to eat grilled fish tonight, Bauer said. She licked her lips as her eyes became incredibly bright. The underworld silk was getting longer and longer. Han Sen had no idea how deep the line had gone. He just kept pulling it in, hand over hand. Suddenly, Han Sen and Bauer felt as if something on the other end of the line had torn loose. The line snapped back toward them like a broken rubber band. The two of them had been pulling their hardest when they were suddenly sent rocketing back into the ground. Bauer shot into Han Sen's chest. And then, the two of them saw something emerge from the lake with the underworld silk. It arced beautifully through the air overhead, then landed next to them with a ringing noise. The two of them turned their heads quickly. They saw a giant gold sword sticking out of the ground, every inch of it gleaming in the light. Holy crap! Aren't we fishing? Why did we just reel in a giant sword? Han Sen looked at the giant, luxurious sword with shock. The enormous sword gave Han Sen the feeling he was looking at something owned by a rich person. The whole thing had been made of gold, and it looked incredibly heavy. It was about 1.5 meters long, and the blade was 1 foot wide. It looked like a small door. There were some engravings carved into the sword. There was the depiction of a phoenix, and there were jewels embedded in the metal. The sword looked very luxurious, especially the center of the handle, which held a fist-sized gold jewel. Han Sen had seen a lot of weapons in his time, but he had never seen a weapon that looked so opulent. How can you fish up something like this? Han Sen mumbled as he stood up. He walked in front of the big gold sword. He reached for the handle to see what sort of weapon it was. Pang! Just as Han Sen's hand touched the pommel, the brilliant gold sword shone brightly. Han Sen felt as if an electric current was coursing through him. His entire body was hurled through the air. He rolled for 100 meters before coming to a stop. Oh no! It's a deified treasure! Han Sen lifted himself off the ground. His whole body was covered in ash, and blood dripped from his mouth. He looked happy, though. Despite his remarkable fitness, the blade had still been able to toss him away and deal that much damage with a single touch. It was definitely a deified treasure. Any item of a lesser rank couldn't possess that much power. You can fish up deified treasure from here? Seriously? Han Sen ran back to the luxurious sword. He still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Han Sen stared at the gleaming sword, and he finally accepted that Exquisite hadn't just been testing his patience. There really were powerful treasures that could be pulled from this lake. Evidently, some of them were even deified. No wonder the very high are so strong. Deified treasures can be pulled from this lake. This cannot be real, surely. Han Sen felt as if his heart was going to leap out of his chest. It had taken them half a day to obtain this deified treasure. If they fished there for a few months, they would be blinged up in all sorts of deified kit. But when Han Sen went to take hold of the gold sword again, the luxurious weapon bounced him away again. Han Sen used all his power to try and hold it, but alas, he could not. However, when Bauer touched it, the beautiful gold sword seemed to rest comfortably in her hands, and it even became smaller. It shrank until it seemed perfectly suited to her diminutive size. This cannot only be used by the person who fished it up, surely. After Han Sen thought of this, he threw his underworld silk into the lake again. He watched the underworld lake and thought, "Come on, baby. Give me a big gold sword, too. I don't mind if it makes me look rich." When the potential reward was high enough, Han Sen could be a very patient man. He squatted down near the lake, and he didn't move for half the day. In fact, in all that time, he didn't even blink. He was hoping he would be able to fish something out. Bauer spun her gold sword around, playing with it casually. But after a while, she grew tired of the weapon. She put it away inside her little gourd. She returned to Han Sen's side with her hand on her jaw. She watched him fish. Han Sen was very jealous of her ability to use the gold sword, but there was nothing he could do about it. It was similar to when he needed to make use of Windstring. He had been able to fire the legendary bow, but he preferred using the six-core snake bow due to its adherence to his will. Are big gold swords the only thing that this lake contains? Han Sen wondered. He didn't think things would be that simple, though. If it was that easy to obtain deified treasures, the very high wouldn't have been beaten by sacred long ago. While Han Sen was in deep thought, he felt his underworld silk twitch. The vibration ran gently through his fingers. "I've got something." Han Sen jumped. He quickly yanked the underworld silk back and began reeling it in. It didn't, however, feel as heavy as last time. There was little resistance, so whatever it was had to be lighter. Han Sen thought to himself, "It doesn't seem like it is another giant sword. Could it be a dagger instead? Or maybe an arrow? It has to be something. If it's a smaller item, maybe I can use it with my six-core snake bow, at least." Bauer happily helped Han Sen pulling the line in. With the two of them working together, it wasn't long until they had brought their catch out of the mist. Just like the last time, when they pulled something out of the lake, it felt as if an elastic band had been broken. The underworld silk suddenly bounced up. Han Sen was prepared this time, however. He stood solidly and didn't fall over. He stared at what was attached to the underworld silk this time. "What is this?" Han Sen saw an old piece of yellowish paper on the end of the line. He reached out his hand and pulled the paper free. When he brought it closer to his face, he confirmed that the piece of paper was exactly what it looked like. "This underworld lake is so weird. How can I fish out paper?" Han Sen opened the old, wrinkled paper. He noticed that there was a drawing on it. Han Sen almost coughed up lots of blood upon seeing what was inside it. He quickly closed it and pushed Bauer's head away. He was not going to let her see the illustration. "What the hell? What is this? Why did I fish out porn?" Han Sen felt depressed. Bauer had fished up a deified xenogenic treasure, whereas Han Sen had pulled out a pornographic image. It was very beautiful, he had to admit. He only looked at it once, but his nose almost bled. It seems as if what can be fished up isn't fixed. If people could just randomly fish up deified treasures, the very high would be very rich. Han Sen thought this was to be expected, but if there was still a chance of fishing up deified treasure, then Han Sen wasn't about to miss the opportunity. So, he lowered the underworld silk and went back to patiently waiting. This time, it took a much shorter time before the line twitched again. It had only been an hour when the underworld silk began to move. Han Sen was so happy, and he pulled the line. Bauer came over to help, and so they reeled in their freshest catch together again. As the two of them worked, Han Sen prayed, "Give me a deified treasure. Give me a deified treasure." Bo! Something came flying out of the lake. When Han Sen saw it clearly, his face almost collapsed. It looked like another sheet of paper. It looked similar to the last one he had brought up. Indeed, when Han Sen took the catch in his hands, it was the same old, yellow paper. He gripped Bauer's head and moved it away. He opened the old sheet of paper to reveal another pornographic image. But this was different from the last one. The people depicted were the same as before, but they were doing things in a different position. Holy crap! Is this whole thing a comic? Han Sen felt depressed. Dad, I want to fish too, Bauer said, as she looked at Han Sen. Sure, it can be your turn to try. After Han Sen put down the underworld silk, he passed it to Bauer. Bauer gave him a pleased grin. She took the silk and squatted near the lake's edge. She stared at the lake intently, as if she was afraid of missing this opportunity to fish. Han Sen went back to researching the Geno arts he had been given. He was still interested in fishing, but he had received 2 pornographic images in a row. So, he was no longer in the mood. Very Real Body was a high-class Geno art. Han Sen followed the teachings and practiced with it. The cells in his body grew numb, as if electrical currents were zapping them. It was a sensation that surged through him from the tips of his toes to the top of his head, reaching into every nook and cranny within him. But the effect was still very weak. It would take a long time to practice, but over time, he should be able to turn his own body into a dangerous weapon. Dad, I got something, Bauer shouted, interrupting Han Sen's practice. Han Sen helped Bauer reel the line in. It felt so very heavy this time, and it had Han Sen thinking, another beautiful, enormous sword? Dad, I wonder what I got this time? Bauer babbled in excitement. She didn't really care about procuring more items for herself, but the mystery of what she might pull out of the lake was tantalizing. She was like a gambler, riding the lightning for all the life and death excitement she could find. Pull it out and you'll find out. Han Sen kept tugging, and before long, they yanked the catch out. The thing that emerged from the mist arced above them like a rainbow and fell toward them, shining like a piece of the sun itself. Han Sen couldn't see what it was due to the intense gleam, but he could feel that it possessed a scary presence. He didn't dare touch it, and he pulled Bauer aside. Pang! That shining thing landed on the shore. Once it hit the ground, the light grew dimmer. Han Sen could look at it safely now. He discovered that the item wasn't as big as he initially thought. It was actually rather small. It was curved like a rainbow, and there were 3 gems shaped like a sun, moon, and star embedded within it. It looked very pretty. What is this? Han Sen asked, his voice confused. It is a beautiful hair clip. Bauer happily picked up the item and put it in her hair. She turned around, looked at Han Sen, and asked, Dad, does it look good? Yes, it looks very nice, Han Sen said while staring at the hair clip. A hair clip? It looks like you can fish anything out of this lake, but judging from the power inside it, this item is rather extraordinary. It seems rather easy to get grand treasures from this lake. Han Sen was so tempted. He told Bauer, Bauer, how about we take turns fishing? Bauer had received a beautiful hair clip. She was so happy. She nodded and gave Han Sen the underworld silk. Han Sen started fishing again, and he took turns with Bauer. The 2 of them created quite a ruckus as they fished. Come out. Give me a treasure, Han Sen was shouting. A piece of yellow paper came soaring out of the lake. Ah, what is this? It looks so pretty, said Bauer's voice. A piece of yellow paper. Bauer's excited voice. A piece of yellow paper. Bauer's excited voice. The same process repeated itself over and over on the shores of the underworld lake. Han Sen looked at the thick stack of yellow papers he had amassed. He wanted to cry. Those pornographic pictures he had fished up over the past few days were enough to compose an entire book. Aside from the yellow papers, he hadn't been able to catch anything. Don't say that, he reminded himself. These pictures look kind of like a comic. If it wasn't for Bauer being there, Han Sen would have liked to examine them in greater depth. Han Sen looked at the Bauer. Her experience fishing had been very different. She had managed to earn all sorts of things. Although they weren't all deified treasures, the things she had collected were all better than the yellow papers Han Sen had received. It looks like my luck hasn't been too good in recent times. Perhaps I should ask Mr. White to calculate my fortunes and find a way to heighten my luck, Han Sen thought, considering various ways he might improve his situation. Just as it was Bauer's turn to fish, the small jade figure reacted. Han Sen quickly pulled Bauer away and sat down on the lakeshore himself, pretending to be in the middle of fishing. Not long later, Exquisite teleported there. Exquisite walked over to Han Sen and looked at him. She didn't see anything next to Han Sen, and she said, "Don't worry. Underworld Lake is often like this. Sometimes it can take a couple of days to get something, other times it can take weeks. I asked you to come here to test your luck and give you some time to practice Geno arts." Han Sen was shocked. Hearing Exquisite, it sounded as if it was supposed to take a number of days to fish something out, but he had always received something in half a day, at the most. The shortest time it had taken those two to fish something out was half an hour. The average, if he had to guess, was 2 to 3 hours. Han Sen had been trying to think of a way to show Exquisite those yellow papers, but he didn't have to do that anymore. "It looks like there are no resources I can use for practice here," Han Sen said, looking at Exquisite. Underworld Lake was magical, but he couldn't stay here if he was only pulling out old pieces of paper. He would rather kill Xenogeneics. "Don't rush anything just yet. Recently, my little sister has needed my help. I don't have the time to take you hunting, so continue practicing here. If you have enough luck, maybe Underworld Lake will give you a pleasant surprise," Exquisite said with a smile. Han Sen might have just been imagining things, but he noticed that when she spoke to him, even though she was still reserved, she tended to smile more and more. She was different from how she used to be. There was a surprise, but the surprise was so big, I wasn't sure how to take it, Han Sen thought to himself. After a brief conversation with Han Sen, Exquisite quickly walked away. She left a few items behind for Han Sen to live off, and she also provided him with vials of Geno fluid. Han Sen had actually brought his own, but he had forgotten to tell her. Han Sen pulled a parasol out of Destiny's Tower, and he also brought out a couple of sunbathing chairs. Han Sen and Bauer settled themselves down comfortably on the shores of the lake to fish. As they did so, Han Sen also set aside some time to research the Geno arts he had been given. The Geno fluids Exquisite had brought him weren't bad. They were good for his body, but Han Sen had yet to find a way to make a breakthrough that would enable him to become half-deified. After another couple of days, Han Sen gave up fishing. He let Bauer do things herself. He focused on practicing his Geno arts. Part of the reason he had given up was because he had continued to receive pieces of paper. It was pointless for him to continue. Whenever Bauer fished, she would retrieve something encrusted in jewels. Each item was ornately wrought and beautifully finished. But aside from the enormous gold sword and the hair clip, Bauer hadn't gotten any more deified treasures. Clearly, deified treasures weren't easily found. Since Bauer had already been able to get 2, though, that was still a fantastic result. Not everything she fished up was a high-level treasure. There were a few ordinary items in there. But whether they were high-class or low-class items, they all looked sovereignly luxurious. Suddenly, Han Sen's eyes flashed. He picked up Bauer and pulled the underworld silk away from her. A minute later, he saw someone approach. It was second brother Liu Jun, the man that Han Sen had met when he first entered Outer Sky. Liu Jun saw Han Sen and Bauer behaving as if they were having a vacation, lying down on their sunbathing chairs with a parasol. There were many snacks and drinks on a table beside them. There was even a nuclear reactor mini-fridge. The sight made him frown. "Exquisite brought you here to practice, not to have a vacation," Liu Jun said coldly. "What has it got to do with you?" Han Sen continued to lounge on the sunbathing chair. He didn't get up, and he didn't even spare the other man a glance. Liu Jun's face looked cold. He stared at Han Sen for a while. Without saying another word, he went to the other side of the lake. He pulled out an underworld silk from his head of hair. It looked as if he had come there to fish, as well. If most people of another race spoke to Liu Jun like that, he would have reacted poorly. But Han Sen was already Exquisite silkworm. There was nothing he could do to Han Sen. That was one of the very high's established rules. Even if a silkworm committed a crime, it was the master of the silkworm that had to deal with it. If Liu Jun fought Han Sen there, he wouldn't simply be fighting Han Senator, he would be humiliating Exquisite. That was why Liu Jun didn't do anything. With Liu Jun being there, though, Han Sen couldn't allow Bauer to fish for him. So, he fished on his own the whole time. Han Sen's situation was still mostly the same, though. He still reclined in his sunbathing chair. He tied the underworld silk to his finger, so he could sense movement the moment it happened. Han Sen then turned his attention back to reading through the Geno arts. He didn't have to look at his line, though. He knew it was only a matter of time before he received another yellow piece of paper. Of course, an hour later, something pulled at his line. He pulled it out of the mist, revealing another sheet of paper. Liu Zhan glanced over when he saw that Han Sen had received something. It was just an old piece of paper, though, so he ignored Han Sen and carried on fishing. With Liu Zhan being there, Han Sen felt uncomfortable. When there was no one, Exquisite could not feel him, and he was able to do anything he wanted to. If he disobeyed Exquisite's wishes while someone was there to tattle on him, however, he could risk getting into trouble. Plus, Liu Zhan had seen what Han Sen had pulled out of the lake. Now, he could no longer hide what he had retrieved. If Exquisite wanted to read the pages, he would have to let her see them. What is this guy doing here? Han Sen couldn't think of a way to get the man to leave, and he couldn't leave himself. He had to continue fishing. After half the day, Liu Zhan felt as if something was amiss. In that short period of time, Han Sen had pulled 3 things out of the lake. They all looked like old sheets of paper. Han Sen was operating at a remarkably efficient catch rate. When Han Sen pulled out his 3rd piece of paper, Liu Zhan put away his underworld silk and walked in front of Han Sen to look at the other man's catch. "Let me see those papers." "Why should I let you see them?" Han Sen asked, his voice relaxed and unhurried. He casually rolled up the paper, then turned a cold glance on Liu Zhan as he spoke. Liu Zhan looked at Han Sen with disdain, then chuckled darkly. "You are with the very high now." "Yes." And? Han Sen's face remained expressionless. Liu Zhan wasn't annoyed. Instead, he smiled and said, "I just want you to know that if a very high asks something of you, you cannot say no." "Oh, yeah? I just said it. What are you going to do about it?" Han Sen said. Han Sen thought Liu Zhan was going to fight him, but it didn't seem like Liu Zhan was going to go that far. He just continued to stare coolly at Han Sen, and then the 3rd eye in his forehead opened. His black and white pupils looked like a Tai Chi yin-yang symbol. That black and white symbol began to spin. It looked like some invisible light was brewing within it. His gaze now looked as if it could see through everything, and it made Han Sen frown. Liu Zhan looked into Han Sen's yellow piece of paper. With a disdainful look, he said, "I thought you had pulled up something nice, but it's just a pornographic picture. I overestimated you, clearly." After that, Liu Zhan went back to ignoring Han Senator. He returned to his fishing spot and continued with the task. It was a coincidence. Liu Zhan sat there and fished for a while, but later on, his underworld silk began to move. It shook a lot, and it appeared as if something big was on the other end. Liu Zhan quickly pulled the line. He tried his hardest to tug it out, but the thing seemed heavy. Pang! After 10 minutes of wrestling with the submerged foe, Liu Zhan managed to pull out an item from beneath the mist of the lake. The object bounced right out of it and landed on the shore. Han Sen couldn't help but look at it. He saw a big gold sword that was similar to the one Bauer had retrieved. It looked a lot rougher around the edges, though. It also seemed to lack the jewels. It was just a big gold sword that was missing its luxurious touches. Liu Zhan looked at the big sword with excitement. He spoke to himself, saying, "Gold slash. Is this the deified gold slash?" The 7th uncle was right. My luck has finally turned around. He picked up the big gold sword with a look of unbridled joy. He was extremely fond of his new catch, and after goofing around with it for a while, he decided to end his day of fishing. He put his underworld silk away and started to leave with the golden sword in his hand. When he passed by Han Sen, Liu Zhan looked at him. He acted as if he was talking to himself, but the words of poison were obviously meant for Han Sen to hear. "This is the luck that separates you from I. You can only fish up that useless and dirty pornography, while I get deified treasures." "Really? Your piece of crap sword is a deified treasure?" Han Sen said with a laugh. "Such an ignorant kid you are. Gold slash is an obscenely rare treasure to fish up from the underworld lake. It is deified at the very least. Although it is a primitive treasure, it is much better than your dirty pictures," Liu Zhan said with a cold laugh. That means there are higher-level gold slashes to be found, right? Han Sen asked. Of course there are. One of our leaders managed to obtain a butterfly-class gold slash, but that doesn't matter to you. Carry on fishing up your useless, dirty porn. Ha. Liu Zhan held his sword proudly and laughed as he wandered off. He laughed in mockery. Han Sen couldn't be bothered with the man. He thought to himself, it looks like the sword Bauer got was also a gold slash. But it is obvious that Bauer's is of a higher class. Which class it is has yet to be determined, though. After Liu Zhan left, Han Sen felt a lot more comfortable where he was. It felt good to have no one watching him again. He planned to fish one more item out of the lake, then let Bauer carry on while he went back to practicing with his Geno arts. Not long later, Han Sen felt the underworld's silk move. Something had latched onto the line. Han Sen thought it would just be another yellow paper, but the item he pulled up was black. It wasn't the same yellow paper as before. Has my luck taken a change for the better? Han Sen's heart jumped. He quickly grabbed the black thing to take a look at it. When Han Sen picked it up, a chill ran through him. This new item was also a sheet of paper, but it was black this time, and it was much thicker than the yellow sheets he had previously retrieved. Am I going to collect 7 different colors of paper before I move on? Can I summon a dragon along with it? Han Sen complained, turning the paper over so he could check it out. Han Sen had a look, and the sight made him freeze. This new piece of paper was indeed quite different. The thick black parchment appeared to be the cover of a book. Furthermore, there were 3 words written on the front. Xin Yellow Sutra. This cover cannot be a cover for all of those yellow papers, can it? Han Sen was shocked. He flipped it over and had a look at all the small words inside the cover. If the man is in chaos, the sky and the earth will be in chaos, and the sky and the earth will turn yellow. Han Sen was shocked. This line of words was the prologue of the Xin Yellow Sutra. This was definitely some sort of Geno art, but it didn't seem to have anything to do with the yellow papers he had collected. Maybe this isn't a cover for the yellow papers. Maybe it's meant for another book? Han Sen thought the entire situation was strange. Han Sen hesitated. While Bauer began fishing, he brought out all of the yellow papers and started to piece them together. He noticed all of the yellow pages had numbers. So, Han Sen arranged them in order of their numbers. There were many missing pages, however. The highest number was 254, but Han Sen only had 20 pages in total. Han Sen put them down next to the Xin Yellow Sutra and noticed that their size was a perfect fit. Still, he couldn't be sure if the cover was really meant for his yellow papers. Han Sen thought this was a bit weird. He looked at the contents of the yellow paper, and when he looked over them, he felt a strange sensation. He thought the pictures had merely been the doodles of some horny guy in ancient times, so he had never inspected them closely. But now that he noticed something. The people in the picture were covered in thin veins of blue and red. The small lines were very light. If Han Sen hadn't decided to examine the papers closely, he wouldn't have noticed them at all. Few drawings were so realistic that they mapped people's veins and arteries. But after a thorough inspection, he realized they weren't blood vessels. The small, blue lines should have been meridians, and the red were likely the presence. Han Sen was so shocked, and he thought to himself, this isn't a porn picture. It is a Geno art. But why would a Geno art look like this? It is easy to misunderstand it. Due to the fact that there were no descriptions or text, and Han Sen was missing many more pages, he couldn't be entirely sure it was a Geno art. But regardless, his interest in it had been sparked. Han Sen took the underworld silk away from Bauer. He continued fishing, and a little while later, he fished up another yellow paper. On a ship that was headed to the Andromeda system, a crystallizer woman turned to a man next to her. She looked afraid. Are you a crystallizer? She asked. Yes, the man said with a nod. He sounded rather cold. The woman looked very surprised, and she said, I can't believe I have met someone of the same race here. My name is Lydia. You took the Hall's quest to venture to the Andromeda system to hunt xenogeneics, didn't you? Yes, the man answered. His emotions didn't seem perturbed at all. That is great. Can we combine forces and do it together? The woman said. No, we cannot, the man answered. The woman seemed disappointed, and she said, That's fine, I guess. What is your name, anyway? Can we exchange phone numbers? There are too few crystallizers here. We can contact each other. No, we cannot, the man said. His face remained impassive. The woman had spoken nicely to the man, but the man hadn't reciprocated by the smallest amount. He never gave her a reply that was greater than 3 words. After they arrived in the Andromeda system, the ship's passengers spread out as they headed to the various planets. The man got off the ship while the woman followed after him. "Why are you following me?" the man asked, turning around and looking at Lydia strangely. "It is because, in this universe, a crystallizer woman meeting a crystallizer man is a 1 in a billion chance. I don't want to miss out on such a rare opportunity. So, please, tell me your name," Lydia responded, lowering her head and mumbling quickly. She spoke in a volume that only dogs could have discerned. Dong-mu. The man finally spoke his name. Lydia looked very happy to hear that. She raised her head, wanting to tell Dong-mu something. But as she opened her lips, before she could speak, Dong-mu's dagger slammed through her heart. Why? Lydia couldn't believe what had just happened. She stared at Dong-mu with shock. She couldn't believe the man would do something like this to her. "It is because I sense something dangerous within you." Dong-mu pulled his dagger back out of Lydia, sending the woman stumbling to the ground. He looked at Lydia's body, then turned around. He left and disappeared someplace into the mountains. Shortly after Dong-mu left, the lifeless Lydia opened her eyes. Weird flashes passed through her eyes, and she stood up like a wooden doll. At that moment, Lydia looked like a lifeless robot. Her eyes were wide open, but they had no focus. It was like lots of data was scrolling through her eyes. It failed again. Such a heartless killer. He killed a beautiful woman of the same race simply because he sensed danger. It is so hard to deal with this guy. After a while, Lydia spoke to herself. So annoying. I have now failed 8 times trying to get close to this target. Another team failed to gain any information from him as well. It is so hard to get information from others who have been in contact with Han Sen before. Since when did the crystallizers become so strong? It looks like this investigation will become quite difficult. After that, Lydia's body suddenly collapsed on the ground. Her light faded, and she looked like a dead body again. "Brother King, has anything special happened to you recently?" Wang Yuheng looked at his phone while chatting with Xie Qingqing. "I made some new friends," Xie Qingqing said, with a cigar hanging from his lips. He was reclined in a CEO chair. He looked really relaxed as he spoke. "Me too. But it looks like something happened with Han Senator. Is he in big trouble or something?" Wang Yuheng said. "Maybe not. Maybe they are just keen on investigating the boy. Otherwise, the people coming to ask us questions wouldn't be so gentle." Xie Qingqing squinted while he spoke. "Then, what are we going to do?" Wang Yuheng asked. "If someone is giving you free money and beautiful women, are you ever going to say no? It would be very rude, and you would be missing out. That would sadden the person making the offer. Of course, we aren't going to do that." Xie Qingqing laughed. "Teehee, that is what I thought too. Lin Feng, Tang Zhenliu, and the others as well. Can you please get in touch with them? Me being here is not a coincidence." Wang Yuheng laughed. Every day, Han Sen remained near the lake and continued fishing out pages of the Xian Yellow Sutra. For some reason, whenever it was Bauer's turn, she always ended up with actual treasures, and every time Han Sen fished, he ended up with a sheet of paper belonging to the Xian Yellow Sutra. This is so F***ing weird. Why can I only retrieve this Geno art, page by page? Han Sen wondered. He couldn't think of an answer. After all, anti-material worlds were difficult to explain. Common sense and logic didn't really apply to such places, and Han Sen didn't want to waste time mulling it over. He just wanted to gather all the pages of the Xian Yellow Sutra as fast as he could. He was keen to find out what sort of Geno art it was. A Geno art that comes from the anti-material world. No matter how bad it is, it must be special, right? Han Sen thought to himself. Suddenly, the triangle symbol on the small jade figure glowed. Han Sen knew Exquisite was on her way over. He carefully synced his thoughts with the small jade figure. Find anything? Moments later, Exquisite teleported right next to Han Sen. Yes, but I did not get any fish. The stuff I've been collecting is pretty weird, Han Sen with a strange tone of voice. Underworld Lake is connected with the anti-material world. It is normal to fish up odd things. What did you get? Exquisite asked. I got some paper, Han Sen said slowly. Liu Zhan had seen these yellow sheets of paper before, so there was no use in hiding it. He had no choice but to reveal what he had found. Paper? What sort of paper? Exquisite asked with curiosity. Although anything could show up in Underworld Lake, it was rare to get something like paper. About that, Han Sen was frozen. When he thought about the lewd content on the yellow pages, he didn't know what to say. Exquisite could sense what Han Sen was thinking. So, she blushed and said, "Never mind. You don't have to tell me. Whatever you get from Underworld Lake belongs to you. Even if you collect a deified treasure, it is all yours. When you leave Outer Sky, you can even take them with you." Thanks. Han Sen pretended to be relieved. I thought you always wanted xenogeneic resources. I have found some for you already. How much you get will depend on your power, though, Exquisite said to Han Senator. She appeared rather mellow. What do you mean? Han Sen asked, curious. Outer Sky has a star tree. The tree produces star fruit, and it is surrounded by powerful space xenogeneics. They are king class at least. Of course, some can even reach deified. Now, you can collect the star fruit, but how many you can collect will depend on you. Han Sen listened carefully as Exquisite explained the situation to him in more detail. The star tree was guarded by seniors of the Very High. Every silkworm of the Very High was allowed one chance to claim star fruit from its boughs. But how many star fruit could be collected would be determined by tests conducted by the aforementioned seniors of the Very High. The test results correlated with how many star fruits could be obtained. Even if the results weren't great, a participant was always guaranteed at least one. 10 star fruits was generally the most one could receive. But the tests were highly variable, depending on which Very High senior was administering them. The personality of your particular administrator is very unique. If he likes you, he will only ask you a few questions. Then, he will let you claim 7 or 8 fruits. If he doesn't like you, he will give you a very difficult question. If you answer correctly, you will only be allowed a small number of star fruits. I hope the man will like you. Exquisite's eyes looked strange as she spoke. Is he often that unreasonable? Is there any point of a test if he just gets to decide regardless? Just make it a beauty contest or something then, Han Sen thought to himself. Exquisite could feel what Han Sen was thinking, so she laughed. The star tree belongs to the uncle alone. Who he shares the fruit with is entirely his decision. Being willing to share with those far younger than him is already a grand act of kindness. So, even if he gives you only 1 star fruit, you should still be appreciative. I see. That makes sense then. If they are his items, then he can definitely dictate the distribution of them, Han Sen said with a nod. This is just a small reward. My generation will soon begin testing silkworms in earnest. If you perform well when that happens, the resources you receive will far exceed the star fruit, Exquisite said. How long must we wait? Han Sen asked. There are 13 of us in my generation. Now, there is only one little sister who has yet to decide on a silkworm. Once she has made her decision, the test will begin. When Exquisite spoke of her little sister, her eyes glimmered strangely. Han Sen's heart felt weird hearing this, too. But he carefully kept his thoughts away from the subject. The little sister Exquisite was referring to was undoubtedly Likir. Likir wanted $1, so Han Sen knew all about that. Let's go. We should head to the star tree. Exquisite placed a hand on Han Sen's shoulder. Then, she teleported Han Sen and Bauer away from Underworld Lake. There were still many Xian Yellow Sutra pages left to collect, and Han Sen wanted to carry on fishing them all out, but it was a long task that he couldn't rush. He would have to wait for the chance to fish again later. When Han Sen saw the star tree, he was shocked. Its boughs almost blanketed the whole sky. It was like a big umbrella that formed a bridge between the land and the sky itself. Many pieces of fruit hung from the tree's branches. They looked like suns, and their light made the leaves of the tree shine like jade. It was so very beautiful, and Han Sen squinted against the light. According to what Exquisite had told him, the test administrator's personality was quite strange. But his story was a legendary one. When a child of the Very High was born, it would be put into one of 2 factions. One faction was responsible for reproducing. They were the ordinary very high, and they didn't practice the very high sense. Their personalities were comparatively normal, and they retained emotions like an ordinary person would. They were similar to Liu Zhen. The other faction was the one exquisite studied with. They learned the very high sense, and at the end of their practice, their emotions were practically non-existent. Their strength and combat prowess, however, were the best of the very high. When a very high was born, it was decided which path they would take. This man was like exquisite. He practiced very high sense, and he had reached deified class with it. He had been only a step away from becoming a true god. But then, he destroyed his very high sense and started anew. Not even exquisite knew why the man had taken such drastic action. But as he began practicing again, the elder guarded the star tree and never left its side. Even the other very high didn't know what level he was at currently. Uncle. Exquisite brought Han Sen beneath the boughs of the star tree and bowed to the roots of the tree. Han Sen and Bauer looked in the direction she was bowing, and there, they saw a giant stone tree root. Despite being made of stone, the root still seemed to be alive and growing. There was a gray-haired man of the very high sitting on it. The wrinkles in his face appeared rougher than the bark of the tree. His white beard reached the ground. He remained sitting where he was, his eyes closed. He was so old that he looked like he'd been petrified. Han Sen wasn't sure what to make of the man's appearance. With the power of the very high, they could keep themselves looking young until the moment they died. Doing that wasn't difficult. He wondered why this man's face looked so old. Upon hearing Exquisite's voice, the old man opened his eyes. His eyelids were very wrinkly, too. He could barely open a small slit to see through. If one didn't look closely, one would never realize that his eyes were open at all. The old man looked at Exquisite. Then, he turned to Han Sen and Bauer. With a rough voice, he said, "It is Exquisite. Have you brought your silkworm? Is it the big one or the small one?" "His name is Han Senator. He is a crystallizer." Exquisite introduced Han Sen and Bauer to him. "You selected a crystallizer? That takes a lot of courage," the old man said. He observed Han Sen's body well. He started to say something more, but he suddenly saw a person teleporting in front of him. "Uncle," the new man said, bowing to the elder. "Liu Zhen, what are you doing here?" Han Sen and Exquisite's heart asked the same question. "Liu Zhen, please wait aside for a moment. Allow me to help Exquisite's silkworm conduct the test. Then it will be your turn," the old man said, signaling him to stand aside for a while. When Liu Zhen heard the command, he bowed to the old man and said, "Uncle, if things are like that, why don't we conduct our tests together?" Han Sen and Exquisite, when they heard it, felt a shock. They didn't know what was going on in Liu Zhen's mind to make such a proposal. When the old man heard this request, he went silent. Then, he nodded and said, "Why not? We can save some time. Let us do the test together, then." Exquisite was unsettled. Usually, ordinary very high silkworms conducted their tests alone, and people of the very high never had to undergo these tests at all. She was confused by why Liu Zhen wanted to take a test, as well. The old man seemed to understand what Exquisite was wondering, and so he said, "I have to travel soon. Others have recommended that Liu Zhen protect the star tree in my absence. If he can pass the test, he will be in charge of the star tree temporarily." Han Sen felt lucky. It was good that they had come now. If they came when Liu Zhen was guarding the star tree, there was a chance Liu Zhen would deliberately make the test difficult for him. It really had been a coincidence that Liu Zhen ran into Han Sen at the star tree. He had only just received the order to go there and take the test. He was there to take charge of the star tree in its current master's absence. Liu Zhen had received a piece of news that few others knew. Once the star tree's elder left on his journey, he might never come back. If Liu Zhen took the star tree now, it was likely that the star tree would forever belong to him. That was why Liu Zhen was so hyped when he arrived there. Watching over the tree temporarily wasn't a very important task, but becoming its permanent caretaker. But when he found Han Sen already standing before the tree, he thought about how rude Han Sen had been to him at the lake. He was just a silkworm, and even so, he dared to offend the very high's second brother to his face. This was a chance to teach the whelp a lesson, or so Liu Zhen thought. This wasn't an opportunity that he could allow to pass him by. Out in the rest of the universe, you might be some kind of generational prodigy. I can understand why you might believe you have a right to be so arrogant, but amidst the very high, you are lower than dirt. If you don't know that already, there is a high chance you won't survive your tenure with us. I'm just trying to be nice so that Exquisite won't end up being dragged down with you. Liu Zhan smirked to himself. The old man then glanced at the tree around him and said, "If this is the way that we're going to proceed, why don't you two remove the bugs from the star tree?" "Remove bugs?" Han Sen asked, raising an eyebrow. This massive holy tree needed insect extermination? That was surprising, to say the least. Because Han Sen had just learned of the tree's existence, he didn't know that part of the tree guardian's job was to remove bugs from it every now and again. Otherwise, the bugs would eat and destroy the tree's fruit. That was what Liu Zhan would have to do if he took over the job anyway. If Liu Zhan hadn't been present, Han Sen's challenge would likely have been something different. However, because of the unique circumstances, the elder had decided that this test would be appropriate for both of them. While we are performing this test, you cannot use treasure or any other special powers. You need to use your own strength to remove the bugs. And while you are doing so, you cannot bring any harm to the star tree. If you damage the tree, you will receive no reward. You will, however, be given punishment, the old man said warningly. "Uncle, what kind of bugs are we removing?" Han Sen asked the old man politely. "There is only one type of bug that dares come close to the star tree," the old man answered. "It is called a star beetle. You will know them when you see them. I will give you a day. You will pass if you can remove 1,000 bugs. Each 100 you remove will account for 1 star fruit." Han Sen was delighted to hear this. He had been worried that even if he did his job correctly, the old man wouldn't allow him to collect any star fruit. Now that he had been given terms and conditions, he could rest easy. This was the best way to conduct business. "We start now. Tomorrow, at this time, you must return here. The bodies of the star beetles can stay on the tree. They will be cleared afterwards," the old man said. Han Sen and Liu Zhan bowed to the old man. Then, they both flew to the top of the star tree. Liu Zhan looked at Han Sen and used galaxy teleport. He vanished into the tree while Han Sen had to continue flying up. The star tree was a Goliath. Each star fruit looked more like an asteroid. Han Sen flew as fast as he could, but it still took him an hour to get to the top of the tree. Liu Zhan had started killing bugs a long time ago, but the tree was simply too large. Han Sen couldn't see where Liu Zhan was. So, he had to look for the bugs alone. Seeing the star tree up close, Han Sen noticed that the star tree's leaves really did look like jade. The giant fruits were crystal clear. Because the old man's request was very strict, Han Sen couldn't do any damage at all to the star tree. Therefore, he didn't dare touch the tree. He kept flying around it. Soon after, Han Sen found a bug lying on a branch of the star tree. It looked as fierce as a dragon, and it was the size of an adult bull. Its armor was sky blue. The light coming from its shell shimmered and glittered like a tapestry of stars, and its face looked like the face of a stag beetle. It had 8 claws, and it had a weird horn that was like a pincer. It looked much more polished than an actual stag beetle, though. Its body was crystal blue, and it shone. It was hard to imagine it was considered a pest. The old man had given him the order to remove the bugs without damaging the tree. Han Sen looked at the bug from afar, but he didn't dive right in to kill it. He observed the bug with his purple-eye butterfly first. Without a doubt, the bug was king class. Judging from its life force and presence, Han Sen was able to predict that it was a 3rd or 4th tier king. Such a creature wouldn't be difficult for him to deal with. Han Sen wasn't in a rush to do anything. He looked at the bug and thought to himself, he said, "I cannot hurt the star tree. That means I cannot hurt it while I fight. I need to kill this bug in one blow so that it can't damage the tree itself by attempting to fight back. It's an empty type xenogeneic, so its body doesn't have an element. It is a xenogeneic based purely on raw strength. That means its shell must be extremely hard, far harder than those of xenogeneics of a similar level. Taking down a creature like this in one hit will be difficult," Han Sen thought to himself. After observing the creature for a while, he was unable to discern any potential weak spots. Its entire body was clad in that starry shell. To kill the bug, Han Sen knew he would have to break through that surface. If there are no weak spots, then I will just have to break it open with brute force. But using brute force will still have the same risks if I miss. If I don't kill the bug instantly, and it struggles, it will likely harm the bark and the leaves on the star tree, Han Sen thought, continuing to observe the beetle intently. Liu Zhan, meanwhile, had reached the tree 1 hour before Han Sen had, and before he arrived, he already knew a lot of information about the beetles. Liu Zhan knew their weak spots, and he knew how to kill them effectively. After finding a beetle, Liu Zhan started taking it down. Liu Zhan hadn't practiced the very high since, but the very high had many Geno arts. There were many top-notch Geno arts available to learn. Liu Zhan was a king, one of the best within the very high, in fact. With many Geno arts at his disposal, it wouldn't be difficult for him to kill a king-class beetle. The beetle's shell was extremely hard. Ordinary king-class fighters of the same tier would have a hard time breaking through its shell, but Liu Zhan only needed a few punches to destroy the beetle. He moved with insane speed. Liu Zhan had found a few dozen beetles to kill before Han Sen had even reached the tree. Plus, when Han Sen found the beetle, he didn't immediately attack. He stayed where he was, observing them for a while. By the time Liu Zhan had killed 100 beetles, Han Sen hadn't even started fighting one. Why isn't Daddy doing anything? Bauer was holding Exquisite's hand and looking into a mirror while she spoke. The image in the mirror displayed both Han Sen and Liu Zhan. Liu Zhan had already killed 100 beetles, but Han Sen had yet to do anything. He is thinking about how to kill the star beetles, Exquisite said. What would he need to think about? Even Daddy's fingers are enough to crush those little bugs, Bauer said curiously. Exquisite didn't answer, but the old man said he's thinking about how to avoid harming the star tree if he moves to attack the bugs. Han Sen spent several long minutes in observation before he finally flew forward to strike that bug. When he was close enough to it, he suddenly disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already above the bug's shell. God's wonder? Exquisite was shocked to see this. She was intimately familiar with the teleporting method he had used. Although he was only teleporting a short distance, the move was still impressive for a beginner. It was strange, though, considering she had only given him God's wonder a short while ago. If Han Sen had become this proficient with it already, he was more than brilliant. His talents really were out of this world. Does he really have an 11 armor talent? Exquisite couldn't help but wonder. Han Sen's body was unique. If the God Spirit Touch's result was genuine, it was nuts. Han Sen teleported behind the star beetle, but the star beetle didn't react. And then, Han Sen pointed a finger at its brain. Ding! There was a small ringing noise, like a steel needle striking bone. It was barely even audible. And right after, Han Sen pulled his finger away. The star beetle didn't struggle at all after the strike. It simply gave a tiny shiver. The beetle grew still again as if nothing had happened, but its life force was waning fast. It didn't take long for its flame to fully extinguish. The star beetle was in the same position as before. It was lying atop the branch, but if one looked closely, one could see a very small hole in its head that led down to the creature's brain. Xenogeneic king hunted. Star beetle. Xenogeneic gene found. A hunting announcement rang in Han Sen's head. What excellent powers of observation. That was a very strong ability. His body is evolving fairly well. Exquisite, I think you found yourself a decent silkworm, the old man said. He looked at Han Sen with a genuine sense of appreciation for the young man's performance. Han Sen's attack had been very good. What the elder admired most about the scene was that Han Sen had taken the time to observe the creature before committing to action. He wasn't a reckless man whose body operated faster than his brain. Recklessness wasn't always a bad thing. If a warrior fought someone of the same tier, the fight was usually a matter of life or death for both combatants. Neither fighter would have the opportunity to spend time deliberating their actions. The body's first response was usually the most useful, but taking care of those bugs didn't require those instantaneous reactions. Han Sen had no idea what the star beetles were before this day. He had only observed them for a moment before killing one in a single hit. He had managed to sever the star beetle's nervous system. It couldn't even react before it died. So, the damage dealt to the star tree was minimized. That was why the old man really admired Han Sen. Liu Zhen had known all about the star beetles before he even began this test, but his methods of attack were still obscenely rough. He wasn't dealing much damage to the star tree, but compared to Han Sen, he was leaving a lot of wreckage in his wake. Han Sen started to attack more of the star beetles. He teleported and used his under-the-sky knife skills. The knife silks he controlled were as accurate as a surgical blade. His strikes would pierce through the beetles' shells and sever their major nerve pathways. Under such precise attacks, each star beetle died without the chance to fight back. Star beetles were falling to Han Sen one after another. Han Sen was like a skilled surgeon. Each cut he made had the precision of a razor. He was able to kill 100 star beetles without missing once. None of the beetles stood a chance of resisting. The old man was shocked. Exquisite's eyes were glued to the video. Her mind was also connected to Han Sen's mind, and it was as if she was with Han Sen, killing those star beetles right then and there. That was the benefit of having a silkworm. She could share a bond and feel the same things as her silkworm did, thereby learning and experiencing something that she wasn't familiar with. It was a learning experience for her, too. As Han Sen went from king class to deified or even further, Exquisite wouldn't level up with him. However, she would feel his evolution process as if it was happening to her. So, when she became deified, she would have all that experience. It was like she was being reborn, and there was no need for her to worry about going along the wrong path. The king-class star beetles were nothing compared to Exquisite. She could kill them with ease. Being as accurate as Han Sen and obliterating a beetle's nerves so that it couldn't even struggle, in addition to the fact he was killing so many star beetles without making a mistake, Exquisite couldn't have done the same. Exquisite could feel Han Sen's reactions, and that was what shocked her the most. Han Sen's simple finger attack looked easy, but before he did it, he used a lot of predictive powers. He calculated everything that could happen while he was performing the strike. Even a straight strike had many potential ramifications depending on its speed and power. If Exquisite hadn't been able to feel what Han Sen was thinking, she never would have guessed that there were so many complicated calculations running through his mind. This guy's power is so strong. It is something you rarely see. Even those of us with the very high sense aren't capable of insanity like this. Exquisite's emotions were quite conflicted. The more she studied Han Sen, the more she believed him to be a scary person. Han Sen no longer looked like he was fighting. It was more like he was finishing work that was supposed to have already been finished. He didn't have to worry about much because everything was under his control. Sharing Han Sen's mind allowed Exquisite to learn a lot, but it also made her feel even more conflicted with facing Han Sen now. The very high were quite full of themselves, and that carried through strongly in how they treated their silkworms. The masters often acted high and mighty. Right now, Exquisite was feeling the complete opposite. The more she learned about Han Sen, the more she thought Han Sen was scarier than she was. Xenogeneic King hunted. Star Beetle. Xenogeneic gene found. Obtained Star Beetle Beast Soul. After Han Sen killed 100 star beetles, he earned a Star Beetle Beast Soul. He looked into his Sea of Soul, and he immediately noticed that the Star Beetle Beast Soul was an armor type. That didn't surprise Han's senator. He had guessed that the star beetles would drop armor beast souls as soon as he saw them. Armor beast souls aren't bad. When I take control of the constellation sea, I can build a human army. At that point, beast souls like this will definitely prove their worth. Han Sen thought about a human army decked out in beast soul armor. It would be a shocking sight. It would be great if there was a deified class star beetle beast soul up for grabs, Han Sen thought to himself. This was merely a random thought, of course. He didn't think he would actually have to fight a deified star beetle because the old man said he wouldn't be allowed to use Geno treasures. He didn't have enough power to kill a deified Xenogeneic on his own yet. Han Sen flew around the tree, searching for more star beetles to slay. He eventually heard a buzzing noise in his ear. The sound seemed to be coming from above. Han Sen raised his head and glanced through the gaps between the leaves. There, he saw a whole bunch of star beetles descending from the sky. They were all coming to the star tree. The leader of the star beetles had a body that looked like icy jade. It glowed with a blue light, which was a beautiful sight. The scary presence proved its identity, as well. It was a deified star beetle. This is exactly what I wanted, but this isn't the right time. I can't use beast souls to fight. I would have to use my own power to fight it, but I'm afraid that wouldn't be enough to defeat a deified star beetle. Han Sen was troubled by this most recent development. Star beetles were very good at physical reinforcement. Even a primitive deified beetle would have a shell that was considerably harder than most primitive deifieds. Even if Han Sen could make use of his peacock soul robe or his 6-core snake bow, punching through that shell would be no small feat. Plus, there was the added fact that he couldn't make use of those tools right now. Don't even think about tackling a deified star beetle. You are better off sticking with the king-class star beetles to get your star fruit. Han Sen continued looking around for star beetles to slay. He didn't know where the star beetles had flown in from, but there were indeed many of them. Han Sen had been worried that the tree might not have 1,000 star beetles for him to kill, but now it looked like there were at least 10,000 star beetles descending on the tree. When the star beetle swarm reached the tree, they spread out and landed on its leaves, branches, and fruit. Their sharp teeth began to gnaw on the star tree. And while the star tree was very hard, their teeth were sharp and hard enough to leave marks in the bark. It didn't seem like a big deal now, but if they kept chewing the tree like that every day, it would only be a matter of time before the tree fell. Han Sen continued killing all that he could. He slew many star beetles, and in 3 or 4 hours, he had brought down 500 of them. He had also earned 3 beast souls. It looks like I should be able to kill 2,000 star beetles before the timer is up. That means I will be able to grab 20 star fruits. But the star fruits are so big. How will I even cart them off? As Han Sen pondered this conundrum, he felt something cold approaching his back. He immediately teleported away. After he teleported off, the deified star beetle reached his old position. It landed on a branch, and its small blue eyes peered at the newly repositioned Han Sen. Oh no, why did this guy come here? Han Sen had deliberately avoided the deified star beetle as he moved on down the tree. He hadn't expected the powerful beetle to come after him and attempt a sneak attack. Han Sen didn't have much time to think about it. The deified star beetle was attacking him again. Its blue body became lightning that zapped its way forward to reach Han Sen. Han Sen wasn't fast enough to dodge the beetle's charge with speed alone. He teleported away again. He put some distance between himself and the deified star beetle. He didn't stop there, either. He teleported again to get even farther away from his attacker. But the deified star beetle wasn't keen on letting Han Sen off the hook. It continued to use its blue light to try to attack him, and Han Sen's teleportation skills weren't taking him far enough away. He couldn't shake off the star beetle. Every time Han Sen appeared out of a fresh teleportation, the star beetle was coming for him like a beam of blue light. Han Sen had no choice but to continue teleporting. He no longer had enough time to continue killing star beetles, as his focus rested on dealing with his new deified foe. Han Sen couldn't help but frown. Because he was being pursued by the deified star beetle, he was missing out on any chance to kill the average star beetles. If he didn't kill 1,000 beetles, he wasn't sure if the old man would allow him to collect star fruit. Weird. Why won't this deified star beetle let me go? Han Sen frowned. This creature seemed very driven to attack him. This is so strange. Why does this deified star beetle keep chasing Han Sen? Exquisite was confused, too. Star beetles weren't very intelligent, and even finding the star tree was a matter of instinct for the creatures. If their intelligence had been higher, they would have fled the moment they saw the old man sitting beneath the tree. Liu Zhen laughed to himself. The moment the star beetles descended, he and Han Sen both saw them. After seeing the deified beetle, an idea hatched in his mind. He didn't have the power to control the star beetle, but he didn't need to control the deified. He just needed to give the creature a target. Han Sen was hunting the star beetles, and wisps of the dead beetle's presence would be clinging to his body. Liu Zhen merely used a secret trick to enable the deified star beetle to smell the presence of the exterminating Han Senator. It drew the deified fiend to Han Sen exclusively. This deified star beetle's appearance has saved me a lot of trouble. I do still need to teach him that lesson. After all, I didn't even have to do this myself. Liu Zhen stopped focusing on Han Sen, and he returned his focus to killing king-class star beetles. Even if Han Sen was able to escape the attacks of the deified star beetle, he wouldn't have the time to kill the king-class star beetles anymore. He wouldn't achieve 1,000 star beetle kills, which would keep him from earning any star fruits. The old man squinted, but his face didn't change. Liu Zhen's trick had been done in secret, but it hadn't managed to escape his attention. Still, the old man didn't say anything. He cared very little about a grudge between two boys. He only needed someone who could effectively protect the star tree. For now, Liu Zhen's performance hadn't been bad. His abilities were higher than others of the same class. He could scrape by and be labeled guardian of the star tree. The trick he used on Han Sen had been unfair, but it was also another way of proving his power. Han Sen knew things couldn't keep going on this way. He didn't have the time to kill other star beetles, so if this continued, he would fail the test. It looks like I can't get rid of it. In that case, I will just ignore it. Han Sen's brain was spinning quickly. Exquisite was worried about Han Sen, but what he did next shocked Exquisite even more. Still being chased by the deified star beetle, Han Sen evaded the next attack, then headed toward a king-class star beetle. From the perspective of others, it might have looked like a coincidence. It would appear that when Han Sen dodged, he had just happened to encounter a king-class star beetle and randomly kill it before teleporting away from the deified star beetle's next attack. It all played out so smoothly. It was like one grand move that happened to look like a coincidence. But Exquisite could clearly feel what Han Sen was thinking. This wasn't a coincidence. Han Sen was planning every move he made. In this high-speed chase, Han Sen still had the power to plan all that. Exquisite knew his methods, but if she was in his shoes, she didn't think she could have pulled it off. The old man, as he watched Han Sen's latest performance, looked stunned. Under the continued pursuit of the deified star beetle, Han Sen took down another king-class star beetle. It was the same as before, and just as precise. The deified star beetle's attacks didn't seem to be hampering him significantly, and he maintained the surgical precision of his attacks. The king-class star beetles never had the chance to fight back, either, so they couldn't deal damage to the star tree. He is so young, and yet he is still so calm. He hasn't freaked out, and he has continued to do everything he has planned to the best of his abilities. This crystallizer really is a genius. You picked a tremendous silkworm, the old man suddenly said to Exquisite. As Liu Zhen was slaying star beetles, he would occasionally hear the roaring of the deified star beetle. Not bad. He has been holding on for this long, but why hasn't he tried to escape the star tree? Liu Zhen murmured casually to himself. He glanced in Han Sen's direction but didn't go towards him. The deified star beetle was pursuing Han Sen because Liu Zhen had enhanced the presence of death around him. Liu Zhen had killed many star beetles himself, though. The deified star beetle could smell that, too. Luckily, Liu Zhen was far away, and he was using a secret skill to suppress the stench of death around him. If he was any closer, there was a chance that the deified star beetle would sense the presence of its fellows' deaths on him and go after him instead. So, Liu Zhen stayed away from Han Sen's part of the tree. He didn't know that his plan to keep Han Sen from killing star beetles actually wasn't working very well. Han Sen kept evading the deified star beetle's attacks, and all the while, he continued to kill the king-class star beetles. He was taking them down faster than Liu Zhen. The old man underneath the boughs of the tree stared upwards in astonishment. The deified star beetle had been chasing Han Sen for an obscene amount of time, attacking continuously. But even so, not a single speck of damage had been brought to the tree. Clearly, it was because Han Sen was guiding the creature quite carefully. Otherwise, any of the deified star beetle's attacks could have hit the star tree and damaged it. That is very unique. The old man complimented Han Sen even more. Although Liu Zhen was very good, compared to Han Sen, the elder thought he was a bit rough around the edges. It wasn't that Han Sen was stronger, but there was a finesse to his performance that put him far above his opponent. Han Sen might not have outclassed Liu Zhen much in terms of power, but the way Han Sen dealt with this problem was outstanding. Liu Zhen, under the same circumstances, wasn't performing nearly as well. Exquisite, can I borrow your silkworm? The allotted day had almost passed when the old man asked Exquisite a serious question. What do you mean, uncle? Exquisite had an inkling of what the elder meant, but the possibility didn't seem realistic. I would like him to spend a year guarding the star tree for me. If I'm not back in a year, You two can take ownership of the tree for me until I return, the old man said with gravity. Exquisite stared at him. She couldn't believe the old man had come to this decision. Allowing a silkworm to guard a star tree, or even get half ownership of it, was something that had never before happened among the very high. Uncle, are you sure you want him to take care of the star tree? Exquisite couldn't believe her ears, and so she had to double-check. Yes, I have thought about it a lot. He really is the best choice for this. Are you willing to let him stay here for a year? The old man answered with certainty. If you really have made this decision, then I would like that, Exquisite stuttered, unsure what to make of this strange turn of events. Han Sen was a silkworm. She should be helping him collect resources, but now Han Sen had been given authority over the star tree, and if the elder didn't come back in a year, Han Sen and Exquisite would be allowed to take control of the star tree completely, half and half. For Exquisite, the star tree represented incredible wealth. Outer Sky was rich in resources, but it was a very dangerous place. With the rules of the very high, after she got a silkworm, she had to gather resources on her own. Collecting resources would be very difficult for her. The star tree was different, though. All you had to do was pick the fruit. The xenogeneics inside weren't as dangerous as the deified xenogeneics to be found out in the wilds, either. The time limit approached. Due to Han Sen's teleportation distance being too short, he was unable to go straight back to the base of the tree. So, he left the tree an hour early to reach the old man on time. The deified star beetle stopped chasing Han Sen after he left. It didn't want to leave the star tree. Liu Jin didn't hear the deified star beetle anymore, so he knew Han Sen had finally left. What was the point in holding on until now? He let himself get chased around by a deified xenogeneic for most of the day. There's no way he actually finished the Elder's test, Liu Jin said as he continued killing star beetles. After an hour, when the time was up, he teleported back to the old man. Because Han Sen was flying back, he reached the Elder at the same time as Liu Jin. Uncle, I killed 24 16 King-class star beetles. Did I pass the test? Liu Jin bowed before the old man. The old man nodded and said, Little Crook taught his student well, it would seem. Although you haven't practiced the very high sense, your power is no worse than those that do. Liu Jin was exuberant after hearing this. Being complimented by an elder like that was something to be very happy about, especially for Liu Jin. Plus, the elder sounded very satisfied with his particular performance. Liu Jin was certain now that he would be taking over the star tree's guardianship. I knew this was supposed to happen. I really was always the best choice. Otherwise, my teacher wouldn't have recommended that I come here and show you what I've got, Liu Jin said with a wide, grossly self-satisfied smile. The old man paused and then he said, But I have already found someone to take care of the star tree. Please convey my thanks to Little Crook for his assistance. Liu Jin had been feeling super cocky moments ago, but upon hearing this, he thought something was wrong with his ears. He must have misheard the old man. Uncle, you said you have already found someone to take care of the star tree? Liu Jin hesitated to ask this, but he still did. He knew it was bad form to question an elder, but Liu Jin was at a complete loss. If the elder had already selected someone, why would he bother going through the song and dance of this test? It seemed pointless, in retrospect. The old man nodded. In his old, rough voice, he said, Indeed. I have found someone who is more suitable to take care of the star tree. I apologize for inconveniencing you, but you may feel free to take 10 star fruits with you on the way out. That will be my apology to you, as an elder, for making you come here for nothing. You brought me here for nothing? Liu Jin didn't know how to react. What did this have to do with the person he selected? The old man then pointed at the returning Han Sen and said, I have decided that he will be the one who is in charge of the star tree. What, him? Liu Jin looked at Han Sen with a gaze of utter disbelief. After everything that had transpired, he couldn't believe that Han Sen was the one being chosen. The elder had selected a silkworm to be the star tree's caretaker. Han Sen was just as shocked when he heard the old man say this. He hadn't expected to be the one taking care of the star tree, either. This had nothing to do with him, and he had only gone there for the star fruit. Elder, did you just make this decision? Liu Jin had been trying to keep a lid on his simmering anger, but he couldn't douse the flames of rage in his heart. So, he had to ask. He didn't understand what part of him was inferior to Han Senator the Elder had chosen a mere silkworm over him to take care of the star tree. And on top of that, Han Sen hadn't even finished the task that the Elder had given him. Liu Zhan thought Han Sen hadn't slain 1,000 King-class star beetles. There was no way he had finished the mission. Yes. The old man knew what Liu Zhan was thinking. After a brief pause, he said, Han Sen did a better job than you. Therefore, he is better suited for looking after the star tree. That is impossible. I bet he didn't even kill 1,000 king star beetles. How can you claim he did a better job than me? Liu Zhan demanded. He simply couldn't believe this. He knew Han Sen had been chased by a deified star beetle the whole time. There was no way he could still have done a better job than one of the very high. Go take a look. You can find out for yourself. Instead of explaining, the old man gestured absently up at the tree. Liu Zhan had received a recommendation for this job. The old man didn't really care about Liu Zhan's personal feelings, but he still owed the young man an explanation. Otherwise, others would question the choice. Han Sen wouldn't earn the job properly, and people would speak ill of the events of the day. Instead of going and looking for himself, Liu Zhan simply turned to Han Sr. How many king star beetles did you kill? 3,614, Han Sen answered. Impossible. You were being chased by the deified star beetle. Even if you weren't, you couldn't have killed that many star beetles in such a short amount of time. Liu Zhan's eyes were filled with disbelief. Because they weren't allowed to harm the star tree when they fought, they couldn't use Geno arts that had an area of effect. They had to kill the beetles one by one with great care. Killing 2,000 in a single day was a shocking sum in itself. But Han Sen claimed to have killed 3,614. That was the sort of tally reserved for deifieds only. It should have been impossible for him to achieve that. And Han Sen had to spend additional time traveling. So he had spent less than a day killing the fiends. Han Sen smiled, but he didn't say anything. Liu Zhan's face hardened. He teleported up to visit where Han Sen had been. Quickly, Liu Zhan found the star beetles that Han Sen had killed. When he first saw them, he thought they were alive. It didn't look as if any damage had been done to them, but their life force was all gone. They were dead. Liu Zhan frowned. He examined the body of the nearest star beetle and discovered the tiny wound on the star beetle's forehead. One hit to kill them by severing their nervous systems. That way the beetles had no time to struggle. That is both a very powerful Geno art and a remarkable control of power, Liu Zhan murmured. But he didn't believe Han Sen could have killed 3,614 star beetles. Geno arts that accurate could only be used in very favorable conditions, and executing a strike like that would be impossible while being chased by a deified star beetle. Liu Zhan quickly flew around. He found many star beetles scattered around, all dead. There were many across the branches, many more across the leaves. They had all died of the same precise head wound. The damage had been inflicted with such accuracy that Liu Zhan wasn't sure if he could do the same even if he had time to prepare. And if he was getting chased by a deified foe, he definitely couldn't have done it. After a short time of searching, Liu Zhan discovered 3,000 star beetles. He then decided to stop looking. Han Sen's number was most likely correct, and there was no way Han Sen could lie to the Elder about how many he killed. But now, Liu Zhan believed Han Sen must have cheated or made use of a powerful weapon. If he hadn't, there was no way he could have slain so many powerful king beetles while also being chased. He teleported back to the old man. Liu Zhan bowed to him and said, "Uncle, can I take a look at your video of the event?" "Sure," the old man said with a shrug. Liu Zhan opened the video of the test. One side of the screen played Liu Zhan's test, whereas the other was a recording of Han Senator. He didn't watch his own video. He focused on Han Sen's. He watched it at 8 times the normal speed, examining how Han Sen progressed in his killing of all the beetles. In the beginning, Liu Zhan was trying to find evidence of Han Sen cheating. But after watching for a while, Liu Zhan's face slowly morphed into a mask of shock. Despite the hot pursuit of the deified star beetle, Han Sen was able to continue hunting the king-class star beetles. Every time he killed one, he moved elsewhere. His progress was as fluid as could be, and there was a satisfaction to watching it all unfold. After watching for a while, Liu Zhan came to the conclusion that the way Han Sen killed his enemies was weird, but he hadn't cheated. Han Sen had treated the deified star beetle like a doll, as if it was no more than a puppet on strings. Han Sen lured it left, and it went left. He lured it to the right, and it went right. It followed him like a puppy dog. But Liu Zhan knew the deified star beetle was no puppy. It was a skilled and dangerous fighter. Even if he used a deified treasure, Liu Zhan didn't think he could easily kill it. Han Sen hadn't used any treasures, and he was still able to play the deified star beetle like a fiddle. Liu Zhan was at a loss. The way Han Sen controlled his surroundings was vaguely reminiscent of a deified, using the very high sense. Even so, it seemed different. Have you practiced the very high sense? Liu Zhan asked Han Sen. Han Sen shook his head. I have never practiced the very high sense. I use Sky Palace's legendary knife skill under the sky. Exquisite nodded and said, yes. He is known for his use of under the sky. Since Exquisite had just confirmed it, Liu Zhan couldn't doubt it any further. Han Sen was Exquisite's silkworm, so his thoughts couldn't be hidden from her. Liu Zhan was so annoyed. He had planned to teach Han Sen a lesson by beating some manners into him. But he hadn't taught Han Sen a lesson, and on top of that, the silkworm had claimed the guardianship of the star tree, a role that had previously been reserved for Liu Zhan. Liu Zhan really regretted it now. He regretted suggesting they do the test together. If he hadn't pushed it, he wouldn't have lost his bid to control the tree. After seeing the replay of Han Sen's battle, Liu Zhan didn't say anything more. He bowed to the old man and left. He was far too embarrassed to stay. They were both 9th-tier kings. Han Sen had been chased by a deified star beetle, and he had still managed to kill 1,000 more king-class star beetles than Liu Zhan. This result crushed Liu Zhan. But when Liu Zhan left, he took Han Sen's video with him. No one knew what he planned to do with it. According to the agreement, you can start off with 36 star fruit. Why don't I round it up and give you 40 then? The old man smiled, and then he went on to say, from now on, you are in charge of protecting the star tree. You can have 10 star fruits a month as a reward. You can take the ones for this month now. So, for now, you may take 50 star fruits with you. Han Sen was delighted. It had been a long time since something this good had happened to him. He quickly agreed. He would only have to watch over the star tree and slay some bugs. That would earn him 10 star fruit a month. It was easy money, and killing the star beetles yielded a form of reward as well. Exquisite explained the method for taking the star fruit to him. Han Sen couldn't wait to start. He flew up toward the star fruits that looked like suns. The star fruit was like an asteroid, but that was just its outer shell. The core of the fruit wasn't nearly as massive. Inside, all kinds of xenogeneics were bred. Every fruit contained different xenogeneics. According to legend, the star tree was a shadow of the universe. Star fruit represented the stars of the universe, so each star fruit held xenogeneics that were specific to the star system that the fruit represented. Thus, star fruit from a single tree could produce many different types of xenogeneics. Of course, that was just a legend. The tree worked a little differently in reality, but the star fruit really did produce different kinds of xenogeneics. And they were at least king class. Outer sky is an amazing place. If this star tree existed within the normal Geno universe, it would throw the entire universe into war. No wonder the Very High never ask for anything or fight for resources like the Extreme King. In Outer Sky, even though their race only has a few hundred people, their resources are seemingly infinite. After Han Sen thought of that, he suddenly realized Outer Sky is between the real world and the anti-material world. Is this zone independent? If it is, that means that a few hundred Very High are using a whole dimension's worth of resources. That is pretty awesome. Plus, Outer Sky has that underworld lake that connects to the anti-material world. They can get anti-material resources while still remaining connected to the real world. That suggests that the Very High have connections to all three worlds. What could be better than that? But this didn't concern Han. Senator Han Sen hadn't been flying for long when Exquisite teleported toward him with Bauer. How long are you going to fly around for? Let me take you there. Exquisite put a hand on Han Sen's shoulder and teleported him to the top of the tree. Han Sen, eyeing each and every star fruit that was nearby, made his choice of fruit carefully. Exquisite told him the star fruit didn't really ripen, but the xenogeneics that were growing inside would make the shell turn dark red when they were grown. If someone picked a star fruit before that, the xenogeneics wouldn't be fully grown yet. The creatures within would be low level. Let me pick a few and try my luck. Han Sen couldn't tell what xenogeneics the star fruits held, so he didn't need to choose carefully. He found a nearby star fruit and flew toward it. The shell of that star fruit was already dark red. It looked like a setting sun, the light of which could still be seen as it slipped beneath the horizon. The star fruit was red like an orb of fire. Han Sen flew to where the branch connected with the star fruit. Following the instructions that Exquisite had given him, he pressed his hand against it. And then, the giant star fruit fell from the branch. The star fruit that fell was falling quickly. It didn't have the sense of mass and gravity that Han Sen had expected, though. It was actually very light. As the star fruit fell, the dark red shell started to melt away. It looked like a giant fireball that was burning furiously, sloughing off layers of itself as it went. The star fruit didn't release energy like you would expect from a fireball, though. It only took a second, and the shell of the giant star fruit dissolved completely, and there was a xenogeneic curled up inside. That xenogeneic looked like a flying dragon. Its head was near its tail, and its wings were folded closed. Its body was covered in green scales. Judging from its long body and tail, it had to be at least 40 meters long. It looks very powerful. It cannot be a deified xenogeneic. Surely, Han Sen pondered, his heart thumping. Exquisite said the star fruits mostly contained king xenogeneics, and very rarely, they would house a deified. But no matter what xenogeneic it would be low level when it emerged. It would be like a freshly born, first-tier king, or in rare instances, it would be a primitive deified. But they progressed like ordinary xenogeneics after that, of course. They could be grown. How much they grew would depend on their talent. Xenogeneics were woken from a deep slumber as they were freed from the core of the star fruit, so they were easy to kill as they emerged. Alternatively, the person who opened the fruit could allow the xenogeneics to fully awaken. The Very High had a special contract. If the xenogeneic signed the contract, then it would basically become the pet of the person who opened the fruit. Of course, this process couldn't be completed if the xenogeneic was hostile. If the creature resisted the contract, then it would remain dangerous and uncontrollable. That was why the Very High generally activated contracts when the xenogeneic inside the star fruit was still sleeping. Being asleep kept the creatures from resisting, granting a much higher success rate for the contracts. This should be an errand dragon. It is a king-class xenogeneic. If it is given enough resources, the errand dragon can be turned into a half-deified creature. It is a good xenogeneic to have, Exquisite said to Han Sen, as she watched the descent of the green dragon. Han Sen was very disappointed, though. It was a meager king-class xenogeneic. For Han Sen, having such a creature would be practically pointless. Exquisite could sense what Han Sen was thinking, so she said, "It isn't completely useless. Star beetles migrate through space, and they only periodically descend to the star tree. If you guard the star tree yourself, you will have to wait for the beetles to descend before taking them all out by yourself. If you had some helpers, however, they could kill the star beetles before they even reach the star tree. Plus, you might need some help once you begin to travel around outer sky. I suggest you sign contracts with most of the xenogeneics that emerge from the star fruit." Han Sen thought that her suggestions were quite reasonable. The old man who originally guarded the star tree only let the beetles descend on the tree en masse because he needed them for Han Sen and Liu Zhan's test. If he hadn't, he would have thinned out the star beetles long before they arrived at the tree. Ordinarily, the star beetles wouldn't even have a chance to touch the star tree. The old man would kill them before they got close. But even if Han Sen set up a defensive net of guardians, beetles would occasionally slip through the net. Han Sen would have to kill those himself. And of course, the old man had performed the task easily, but he had been much stronger than Han Sen currently was. If a large swarm of star beetles headed for the star tree, he would need some backup. Han Sen looked at the sleeping errand dragon. He knew it was going to wake up soon. He had to make a decision before then. If it woke up, he would be forced to kill it. It would be harder to force the creature into a contract once it was awake. Setting aside his hesitation, Han Sen used the method that Exquisite had taught him and initiated a contract with the Errand Dragon. When the contract was complete, a weird spell coalesced over the Errand Dragon. The spell flashed repeatedly, waking the Errand Dragon up. The Errand Dragon spread its wings and unleashed a roar that shook the sky. Then, the beast looked down at Han Sen. Han Sen curiously sent a thought toward the Errand Dragon, and the creature responded immediately. With a light flap of its wings, it lowered itself by Han Sen's feet. Han Sen stepped up onto the Errand Dragon's back. Feeling good, he said, having a mount will be pretty nice. I can use this guy like a transport ship. When I get enough resources from around outer sky, he can haul cargo for me. I still have another 49 star fruits to select. I hope I can get a few deified xenogeneics. Han Sen thought to himself. Then he turned and flew toward another star fruit. Han Sen picked 10 star fruits one after another. Each xenogeneic that emerged was a first-tier king. The only differences between them were their breeds and their potential for development. Although creatures that came from the star fruits always started at first tier, the lowest king rank, they were still adults. Han Sen could help them develop by providing them with resources, but there was a limit to how much they could evolve. Bringing most of these kings up to deified would be an impossible task. Half deified was likely as far as they could go. He had yet to find a deified xenogeneic, and that alone disappointed Han Sen. Exquisite comforted him by saying, "Few of the fruit hold deified xenogeneics, so it isn't strange that you haven't found one yet. You still have another 40 chances, too. There is no need to rush this process. If your luck is decent, then 1 or 2 of your 50 fruit should hold deified xenogeneics." What she said was correct, but it still made Han Sen depressed. "Dad, Bauer wants to pick some fruit, too," Bauer said, looking up at Han Sen and tugging at his clothes. Since Exquisite could feel what Han Sen was thinking, Han Sen was careful to keep his mind blank. He told Bauer, "Okay, you can help Daddy choose some star fruit then." Bauer was enthused, and she began to look around with wide eyes. Not long after, she pointed at a star fruit in particular and said, "I want that one." Han Sen picked up Bauer and went there. He flew to the top of the star fruit, and Bauer's hand touched the point where the fruit and branch connected. Then, the star fruit fell. Han Sen watched the star fruit's shell melt away. He knew Bauer always had good luck with things like this, so he was hoping to take advantage of Bauer's good luck to amass an army of deified fighters. The shell began to peel away, revealing the xenogeneic on the inside. Han Sen looked carefully at the strange xenogeneic. Its body was very small, barely larger than Han Sen's clenched fist. It had really big ears and a tiny, Q-shaped tail. The body was stout and circular. It looked like a fat, little, pink pig. "What is this xenogeneic?" Han Sen asked, looking at Exquisite. He could sense that the life force of the creature he had just discovered wasn't strong. It was just like the other xenogeneics he had selected. It didn't have the presence that a deified creature would have, either. And presence aside, it certainly didn't look like a powerful warrior. "I don't know. I can't recognize every xenogeneic in existence," Exquisite said with a shake of her head. "It looks like Bauer's luck doesn't always pan out in my favor. I thought she could get me a bunch of deified xenogeneics." Han Sen couldn't help but sigh. Exquisite rolled her eyes. This man was actually using his daughter for his own gain. She had never seen someone this obscene before. There seemed to be no limits to his shamelessness. But Bauer seemed to really love the fat little creature, and she bent over and picked the pig up. She rubbed its fat body because it felt really good to touch. "Dad, can I have this little pig as my pet?" Bauer asked Han Sen while looking at him. "Of course you can." Upon seeing that the little pig wasn't a deified xenogeneic, Han Sen was fine with giving it to her as a pet. He had enough king-class xenogeneics as it was. Bauer was so happy to receive the creature, but she didn't sign a contract with it before waking it up. Exquisite twitched in shock. Bauer had woken the creature up without signing a contract. Xenogeneics without a contract were as dangerous as any wild xenogeneic. But after the little pig woke up, it showed no signs of aggression. It lifted its round body and started running around Bauer joyously. It looked very happy. Bauer picked it up, and the little pig didn't resist. It rubbed its face against Bauer's hand. Thank God it isn't an aggressive xenogeneic. Exquisite felt relieved. Bauer, continue, Han Sen said to Bauer. Bauer nodded. She let the little pig go and then flew to another star fruit. The little pig took off after Bauer, its bum wiggling. Bauer swiftly decided on another fruit. The flesh of the falling fruit sloughed away, and when the slumbering xenogeneic inside was revealed, Han Sen and Exquisite were given a fright. It was another little pig. It looked exactly the same as the first one that Bauer had chosen, and it was the size of a man's fist. It was chubby, too. The two little pigs now looked like twins. Weird. Two different star fruits shouldn't yield the same xenogeneic twice in a row. Yet these two appear to be of the same race. Why has she found two little pigs that are identical? Exquisite looked at the pigs in confusion. Han Sen looked at the two pigs, and he realized there was a difference between them. When he looked closely, he realized there was a white symbol on the forehead of each pig. Since the symbols were almost the same color as the pigs, the symbols were difficult to see unless you were very close to the pigs. The forehead spell that was on each pig was different, however. Han Sen had no clue what they meant. Han Sen looked at Exquisite. Exquisite shook her head. I don't know what this means either. There are too many different kinds of xenogeneics. Perhaps this is one of the rare breeds. But judging from their presence, they should only be king class. And they aren't aggressive. Why is Bauer's luck broken today? Han Sen thought glumly. She had just discovered a pair of little pigs, and they wouldn't even attack. They seemed useless. They wouldn't even be useful as slaves. Bauer took the two little pigs with her to open up more fruit, and what happened next made Han Sen and Exquisite freeze in place. She found another little pig. Before Han Sen could say anything, Bauer started jumping around the star tree. She kicked down many star fruits. More than a dozen of them were falling through the air before Han Sen could open his mouth to protest. Exquisite quickly teleported over to Bauer to pick her up. The star fruits fell, burning like dying suns. They quickly dissolved and revealed the xenogeneics inside. Han Sen and Exquisite's eyeballs almost popped out of their skulls. Inside those star fruits were more of the little pigs. The small pigs woke up fast. They opened their eyes as soon as their shells melted away. In moments, they were all merrily running around the first two pigs. They trotted next to Bauer, and they looked very happy. What is this? Even Exquisite's face was wrought with confusion. It was a single breed of xenogeneic, yet there were so many of them. The star tree had never done anything like this before. Han Sen and Exquisite looked over the pigs, and aside from the spells on their foreheads, everything about them was the same. Bauer, you have collected so many pigs. You should let me open the rest, Han Sen said with a strained smile. He'd been hoping Bauer would get him a few deified xenogeneics, but it didn't look like that was happening anytime soon. And at this point, Bauer could start her own pig farm. There were 16 little pink pigs running around. They all lined up around Bauer. Bauer didn't comment on what had happened, but she seemed very pleased with her choice of fruits. She didn't show any desire to pick more of them. I guess I'm on my own. Han Sen looked around. He saw a star fruit that looked fairly pretty, and so he flew up to it. This fruit is very puffed and full. It does seem very rich. It is obviously a sign of happiness. It must surely have generated a deified xenogeneic. Those who studied physiognomy believed they could judge the personality of a person merely by studying that person's facial features. Han Sen attempted to apply the same principle to the fruit, running his hands over its surface. Huh, are you trying to read the fruit's physiognomy? Exquisite couldn't help but laugh. The very high had physiognomy skills, as well, but they had never thought about trying something like that on a star fruit, of all things. Humans have faces. Fruits have faces, too. If humans can receive physiognomies, then why can't fruit have a physiognomy? Han Sen replied in a dignified manner. He actually didn't understand physiognomy. He had merely seen a reference to it in the texts of the Xian men. Han Sen had barely glanced over the topic. He couldn't even be called a beginner. He couldn't actually read the face of a human, let alone of a fruit. Right now, he just needed something to reassure him that he wasn't making another blind choice. He desperately hoped to receive a deified xenogeneic. But God didn't give people what they wanted very often, and Han Sen had thus far only been able to receive king-class xenogeneics. He had selected many fruits, but they all turned out to be kings. He could only use them for grunt work. So, overall, they wouldn't be very useful. After choosing more fruit, Han Sen realized he only had 2 left. Upset by his disappointing results, he grabbed the 2 nearest to him and slammed them down. Bauer was useless now. Han Sen could only depend on his own luck, and that wasn't working out well for him. The 2 fruits dissolved quickly, revealing the xenogeneics inside them. One of them was a wolf. Han Sen immediately recognized that its presence was king class, but the other one made him quite happy for a change. It was a rock giant. It was in a sitting position, holding its knees. It was 10 meters tall, and its body was entirely composed of black rock. It seemed to radiate strength. It looked like a little mountain, in many ways. A deified xenogeneic, can you believe it? Finally, I have received a deified xenogeneic. Feeling the mammoth presence of the rock giant, Han Sen was thrilled. Exquisite felt relieved. 1 deified xenogeneic out of 50 fruits was an ordinary shake of luck. While the rock giant was still sleeping, Han Sen quickly signed a contract with it. Outer Sky was full of deified creatures, and having a deified fighter by his side would make life much easier for Han Sen. Especially if he wanted to kill star beetles in the future, having a deified xenogeneic to help would save him a lot of trouble. Han Sen brought his group of xenogeneics over to the old man. The old man didn't say much. When his gaze passed over the little pigs around Bauer, he seemed surprised. "Uncle, I wonder what these little pigs are. Why did xenogeneics that are so similar come out of so many fruit?" Exquisite asked. "The star tree is a true god plant," the old man said simply. "It possesses the energy of the universe. It isn't something that I fully understand. It has its reasons for existing, however." After that, the old man brought out another item to present to Han Sen. "This is my token. You need to use it when you clear out beetles in the future. Every 10 days, come back and take care of the star tree. Whenever a swarm of bugs arrives, you must make sure that you clear out each and every one. None of them can be allowed to live." Han Sen bowed and accepted the item. It was a small stick. It was aqua-colored, and it looked like it was made from jade. The item had a very strong presence. It looked like a deified treasure. Han Sen hadn't expected to receive a powerful item out of this deal, but he quickly took the jade stick and bowed before the old man. "Do not worry, uncle. I will do my best to take care of the star tree until you return. You may leave now. Come back again in 10 days, the old man said dismissively. Bauer and Exquisite joined Han Sen as he turned to depart, but Exquisite was unable to teleport so many creatures with her. Even if she had used her small ship, there wouldn't have been enough room for all of those xenogeneics. So, for now, Han Sen left the creatures there. He would be returning to the tree in 10 days. Anyway, Bauer's small pigs were only a fist size, so transporting them wasn't difficult. Han Sen pulled out a bag and stuffed all of the pigs inside it. He carried them to the small ship. "You should let them out. They won't take up much space anyway," Exquisite said. She could see the pigs writhing around in the bag in an obvious state of discomfort. Han Sen realized that she was right. He released the little pigs and allowed them all to happily run toward Bauer, who was standing in the front of the ship. Altogether, they watched the majestic scenery go by. "Do you want to go back to Underworld Lake, or would you rather hunt some xenogeneics?" Exquisite asked Han Sen as both of them rested in the back of the ship. "Let's go back to Underworld Lake. I think it will be safer if I practice more with God's Wander before I begin hunting xenogeneics," Han Sen said. "Sure." Exquisite nodded and delivered Han Sen to Underworld Lake. Unless someone had space teleportation, they would have to use a ship like Exquisite's to travel around Outer Sky. The ship had a special power buff that deterred the creatures in Outer Sky from attempting to break it. Not even deified elites could travel through Outer Sky on foot without trouble, and Han Sen wasn't even deified yet. So, Han Sen wanted to practice space teleportation so he could travel around Outer Sky with greater ease. He didn't plan on hunting down xenogeneics yet. And of course, Han Sen also wanted to fish up the rest of the yellow papers he had been in the process of collecting. That was the main reason he had asked her to take him to Underworld Lake rather than the wooden house. Exquisite could feel what Han Sen was thinking, and it made her blush. She thought Han Sen wanted to see more of the pictures on the yellow papers. She didn't know the yellow papers actually seemed to represent some sort of Geno art. They soon arrived back on the shores of Underworld Lake, but this time, Exquisite didn't leave. Instead, she remained to fish alongside him. That was quite frustrating. With Exquisite there, he had to control his thoughts, and that was no easy task. Even Han Sen struggled to keep his thoughts in check. Han Sen enjoyed practicing his Geno arts, and Exquisite got to experience everything that he learned as well. Although Exquisite had already learned God's Wander, watching Han Sen practice allowed her to learn some new things at times. But Exquisite was caught off guard by Han Sen's fishing success. Before she pulled out a single thing, Han Sen had already managed to reel in a few items. But Han Sen only seemed to be retrieving those yellow papers. Whenever Han Sen looked at them, she could feel it. And every time he did, her face blushed. Bauer was now close friends with the small pigs, and she played with them nearby as Han Sen and Exquisite fished. The pigs kept Bauer occupied. Otherwise, she would have been bored out of her mind. The little pigs continued to look passive, and they didn't exhibit an ounce of aggression. While they made for nice pets, they were useless. Han Sen felt a little disheartened every time he looked at them. After a few days, Han Sen couldn't stand being watched by Exquisite anymore. So, he told her that he wanted to go to the core area. But Exquisite told him that outer sky was between the real world and the anti-material world. Due to the presence of space barriers, he couldn't enter the core area. Han Sen tried it anyway, and he really couldn't enter the core hall's door anymore.